Describe to me what you saw when you looked into his bedroom.
It looked like he was asleep in his bed, and I said, hey, get up. He didn't move, and then when I walked over the bed, I saw it looked like a brain or something coming out here.
3 large caliber gunshot wounds to the head are really ugly.
The vast majority of homicides in New Hampshire aren't whodunit. This was a whodunit.
So why did you have to shoot him then?
I didn't shoot him.
Information to solve cases comes from people telling you things.
I don't know nothing.
And if people do not want to talk to you, then you can't solve anything.
Just be truthful. All right?
It's easy to mess with someone's head when it's filled with fear. How much can I make you believe that you're going to be tortured for the rest of your days on this planet unless you start telling me the truth?
Did you shoot that man?
Pressure works.
My name's Gary Bartis, born and raised right here in Manchester, New Hampshire. I grew up in a housing project, so there were 2 choices, be a criminal or be a cop. And I just wanted to be a police officer.
And the last service rank one is for Gary Bartis.
And I was a police officer in the state for 44 years. I was a detective sergeant with the Auburn Police Department.
Auburn is a lot of open fields, beautiful, like suburban homes. You think when you're going somewhere like Auburn that you're in a safe, family-oriented, pretty quiet location.
People would always ask me, well, what do you do as a cop in Auburn? I said, I do the same thing as a New York City officer does, just a lot less of it. That morning, I was actually in the station. We received a 911 call that there was a dead body.
There are always murders on Christmas. I always had a homicide, either Christmas Eve or Christmas Day. Everybody's home, everybody's drunk, and somebody is unhappy with yet another tie.
When I first got to the scene, I was very familiar with the property. It's like an old cottage going back to like the 40s. It's on a big piece of land.
The officers who first discovered the body have confirmed, in fact, that the victim is the homeowner, 50-year-old George Jodwin.
George Jodwin was well known in the area. Never had any real serious calls to service at that residence.
Bartis goes as directed by the patrol officers on the scene to the upstairs master bedroom.
First thing we see is George is in bed. For lack of a better terminology, it looked like his brain was on the pillow.
They see a person with gaping gunshot wounds to the head. Large caliber gunshot wounds to the head are really ugly. It's like dropping a grenade in somebody's ear canal. It's incredible the amount of damage it does.
There was blood splattered on the headboard of the bed and as well as the wall.
They look more closely at the gunshot wounds, 2 in the head and 1 in the neck.
There were no shell casings in the bedroom, which indicated to us that it was a revolver.
George was tucked under the covers. He didn't change into any pajamas or anything like that. There was no signs of any struggle.
He's in a relaxed position, probably passed out from alcohol. You can always smell alcohol in someone's breath if you're close to them, but you can also smell it in their blood. He appeared to just be asleep when he is executed by somebody with a large caliber handgun, and probably never felt it. Bartis can't think of a single reason why someone would want to fill his head with bullets, yet here he is.
What I knew about George is that he had a personality, a big personality. He owned a pawn shop on the west side of Manchester.
He was active in the community. He did run for the city office. He had his pilot's license. He played the piano. He owned a yacht, and he would go sailing to different countries.
He's a confirmed bachelor. He is very successful in business. He paints a picture of a very interesting man, a Renaissance man, perhaps.
The Jodwin family was very well known. You just don't expect a family like that to be victimized.
You don't really realize that these things could happen in your town until they do. And it is a shock and a wake-up call that these things can happen to anybody anywhere.
Nothing in the room was really disruptive except for some dresser drawers that were open. And so I thought that was kind of like odd. What would be the reason for that?
There's no real fast, crazy tossing that happens in burglaries. Is this just a mess? Or was someone looking for something in George's dresser?
The house didn't have any signs of forced entry. As a matter of fact, the door going into the kitchen was wide open, unlocked. There was no pry marks, nothing indicating a burglary. To me, as an investigator, that indicates that the person that committed the crime knew him. The kitchen was a pile of dishes in the sink. There's some empty alcohol bottles.
It's the holidays. Perhaps a party was underway on the 26th, and this is the result, the aftermath of a party. The obvious question is, who is at this party? It would be likely to consider that one of them is responsible for this death. They do an area canvass. Most of the neighbors report that there were multiple gunshots in the afternoon, but explain that that's not unusual. Mr. Jodouin often does target practice on his own property. The only thing that bothered them was they heard 3 distinctive gunshots late at night, which is something that's never happened before.
The neighbor that lives directly across the street, he had heard the gunshots, looked at his digital clock that was on his bedstand and it said 10:48. So we knew the time frame of the actual murder.
When something bad happens, something this big, things spread like wildfire. All of a sudden, everybody knows what's going on.
George Jodouin's brother arrives, Peter Jodouin, and wants to do everything he can to aid the police. It's fortunate that Peter arrived when he did because he was present at the party the house appears to have had the night of the victim's death.
Peter was telling us that that particular day, on the 26th, he had found George's .44 Magnum in a piano that George had given him, and he brought it back knowing it was George's weapon.
They asked Peter who was in attendance at this affair, and he says,
one of George's friends, Ricky Karen, was there.
Ricky Karen had used George's land to go hunting for birds, and then Arthur Collins had showed up.
Arthur Collins was kind of a handyman, junk man, do anything for you for a buck kind of guy. Was there towing a vehicle off the property.
So there were 3 people with totally different reasons for being there. So they decided to take the gun Peter brought in target practice.
They were having a few drinks and they were target practicing with a .44 Magnum.
It's a .44 Magnum revolver, so no ejected casings. .44 Magnum is one of the largest calibers available in a handgun, so it would produce massive gunshot wounds, the same type that George Jodouin suffered from. So Bardis reasonably concludes that that's the murder weapon, and whoever used it took it with him.
We were told that Arthur left earlier.
And then eventually Peter had to leave because his daughter had a high school basketball game.
So when he left, the only people present were George Jodouin, the victim, and Ricky Karen. They asked Peter, well, Ricky, does he get along well with George? Well, yes and no.
They would have some squabbles about foolish things sometimes, but that's just the way their relationship was.
So now we have 2 guys in a room separated by a .44 Magnum and a bunch of alcohol, and they have a history of arguments. So Ricky Karen is obviously the momentary focus.
Just as Peter was telling us that Ricky was one of the last ones to see George alive, Ricky arrived at the scene.
How convenient, Mr. Karen.
He was nervous, he was upset, questioning what was going on. Why is he there? It was just, to me, very suspicious.
At that moment, Bardis looks at Ricky Karen's pants, and they're covered in dark red specks.
The assumption was they were bloodstains.
There is a cloud of blood that emanates from a gunshot wound. The blood moves toward the killer. The killer is going to have high-velocity blood spatter on his clothing. It seems that Mr. Karen has a little explaining to do. Ricky Karen has shown up at the scene with what looks like high-velocity blood spatter on his pants. Karen says, I don't know what you think that is, but what it is ink. I'm a screen printer. You never take a suspect at his word, but you do take what you think might be evidence from his person, and in this case, it's his pants.
We brought him down to the police station, give him a pair of sweatpants, so the genes could be tested to find out if that was actually blood or some other substance.
So, as it turned out, after the pants were examined by forensics, the dots, they're not human blood, they are ink, as Karen said they were.
But we still wondered if he had anything to do with this because he was the last one to see George alive. Ricky was concerned, nervous. He says he was on his way to have breakfast and saw the police activity and decided to stop and see what was going on. To me, it's not a coincidence that he's showing up.
They questioned Ricky Karen about the prior day. What happened after everyone left but you?
We had a little more small talk, George and I, talking about how he had some land for sale somewhere up north.
You left George's house. Do you know what time it was roughly?
Well, I know when I left, it was dusk. I had to go pick up my girlfriend then. And that was the last time I saw my friend.
Ricky talked about going to the Aloha restaurant in Manchester. And I personally talked to a bartender, and she verified that he had been there.
Ricky Karen did not kill his friend. He had no opportunity to kill his friend. So they asked Ricky Karen, did George say what he was going to do for the rest of the evening? Well, he did say Arthur was going to come by later, George's handyman.
You always look at who's the last person to see him alive. We ended up reaching out to Arthur and told him that, we need to speak with him.
Arthur Collins was interviewed by me and by Jim White of the state police.
Arthur, could you just tell us a little bit about the relationship with George?
Yes. I met him at the pawn shop. He's my friend. We drink buddies too,
Arthur Collins does have a long association with the victim. He does odd jobs for him.
Wednesday afternoon, what was your contact with George?
He said, come over and get a couple of junk cars I had. So I did. I had to fix the tire for him. So I made another trip and dropped the tire off.
Arthur says, I got there at 7 o'clock. We had a couple of beers.
I had some drugs and then I went home.
What time did you get home on Wednesday evening?
I'd say 9:30.
We know from the neighbors that the shots were heard, the fatal shots, at 10:48 p.m. Mr. Collins has a solid alibi.
We felt suspicious about Arthur Collins because the way he interviewed, he was nervous. But after checking the alibi and finding out that what he said was verified by his wife, he dropped off the suspect list.
So who came by after Arthur Collins left and wound up killing our victim? In every murder case, it's always interesting to speak to who found the body. Did you know to find it because you created it? George's body was initially discovered by his business partner, Glenn Baruti. They'd been partners for several years in the pawn shop. I buy and sell everything. Everyone in town describes him as George's best friend.
We had gone into the pawn shop. We spoke with Glenn.
I was supposed to meet him at his house. He was planning on taking a trip to Thailand at the end of the month. And he's got animals that have to be taken care of out there.
So that's supposedly why Glenn went over there, to be taught how to take care of the animals while George was out of the country.
I pulled in a little after 9. I saw his front door was open. I walked in the house figuring, he was in the shower or something.
Describe to me what you saw when you looked into his bedroom.
It looked like he was asleep in his bed, and I said, hey, get up, your animals are hungry. He didn't move. And then when I walked over the bed, I saw it looked like a brain or something coming out here. And I ran out of there.
Now, Bardis expects to hear the next thing is that he called 911. He didn't do that. Baruti says something off the wall.
I didn't know what to do. I went to my father. I said, you gotta call the police. I can't do it.
You didn't speak with the police?
No.
The fact that he rushed out of there to his father's house without calling the police, it's very odd.
And one thing you don't like when you're a homicide detective is something being odd.
What time you closed the business last night at?
Yeah, 7 o'clock.
And then what did you do?
I went right home. He left over turkey and ham and stuff. I read Pike magazine in bed and shut my light. And that was it.
Okay, what time about did you think that was?
It had to be a little after 9.
Glenn Baruti does not have a verifiable alibi of any kind. So investigators try a different angle. Bardis asks Glenn if he can take a look at the pawn shop's records.
Glenn was very, very forthcoming. He let us into his office.
So they're going through paperwork. And inadvertently and innocently, they come across a recent last will and testament of George Jodewin. Ooh, look at this.
George had changed the will and put everything in Glenn's name.
So he was going to be the heir of everything. He had the business, the house, the boat. So Glenn had the most to gain. And I felt he's the man that committed the homicide.
They have encountered no one else with a motive like this. And it is one hell of a motive. New Hampshire detectives are looking into the violent death of George Jodewin, and the natural emerging suspect is Glenn Baruti, his business partner and heir to George Jodewin's fortune.
We did a polygraph. The polygraph came out inconclusive. We also did a surveillance. We followed him all night, and it was uneventful. We didn't develop anything outside of our, the old police gut feeling. We really had nothing on him.
He has suspicions, yes, but there's no such crime as suspicion.
During the whole investigation of George's homicide, we interviewed many people, friends, business associates, and none of it ever developed anything serious to give us a solid suspect. We ran out of leads, and the case went ice cold.
Are you frustrated at this point?
I don't get mad. It's not my personality. I did my job, did the best we could. In law enforcement, we know that somewhere along the line, even if a case goes cold, somebody's going to talk.
So we're driving on the bridge into the west side. Several times I've heard other people yelling out to say, hey, Bobby, yeah, come get your coffee and all this stuff. People know you around town.
Well, when you're born here, a lot of people know you. And when you work here, especially as a policeman, it makes it easier for people to trust you because they know you. My name is Robert Freitas. I'm born and raised in Manchester, New Hampshire. I'm retired from the Manchester Police Department. I think any cop that you talk to who's retired will tell you the same thing. It's the greatest job in the world. So in 2011, I became involved in this case as a member of the New Hampshire Cold Case Unit. Members of the Jodewin family had contacted the Cold Case Unit about bringing George's case to the forefront of our investigations. They were very proactive with trying to get information to solve it.
This was a whodunit. The vast majority of homicides in New Hampshire aren't whodunits. There was a lot of talk about this homicide for a long time.
It has a larger impact than you can imagine because it makes us as a community feel safer to have an ending to a case like this.
The whole idea of attacking an inactive murder case is to begin on page 1. Review this case as if it just happened. Take a cold look at this with a new set of eyes.
Bill Barry with the Auburn, New Hampshire Police Department. He was working with me on this case.
Once I get involved with a case, I dig like a pit bull. I'm not going to let go.
I'd known him for a long time. We think alike. And we kind of gelled together. We came up with a plan to reinvestigate. Reviewing the case, we knew that Ricky Karen, Arthur Collins, and Peter Jobin were there that night. And Glenn Baruti was the one that found George in his bed on that morning of the 27th of December. But was it possible that somebody else could have been involved? We thought potentially, was it maybe a jilted lover, somebody that George may have been involved with at some point?
George Jodwin had a reputation as being a ladies' man. Jealousy is always a powerful emotion. What if he's dating someone and then she discovers that there are other women in his life? Well, hell hath no fury, as they said. So he starts there. Freitas, over time, he meets with many women who have enjoyed George's company. But they all say one thing: he's a gentleman. Not a heartbreaker, but they discover some interesting gossip. There was a rumor that George Jodwin was bisexual.
Through the investigation, there were a lot of weird stories that came out about George.
But no one wants to confirm anything. So they developed no suspects from any of that conversation. Freitas is being thorough. So he continues looking into past relationships, and they come across a woman named Tammy Floyd. And she just so happens to be the sister-in-law of George's handyman, Arthur Collins, typical of a small town.
We went to Tammy's address in Manchester, New Hampshire, to speak with her about a potential relationship that she had with George Jobin. And her daughter, Belinda Floyd, was also there.
While we were talking to Tammy, I had asked her if she had a relationship with George.
Tammy Floyd denied any relationship whatsoever with George Jobin.
So we kind of ruled that out.
At that point, we asked them about any recollection they had of the night of George's homicide.
One thing that Tammy did finally say was, well, my daughter was actually at Arthur's house the night of the murder.
Her daughter, Belinda Floyd, told us she had been at Arthur's home that night playing cards with Arthur's wife.
Freitas thinks this could be a real opening. No one knew Belinda existed.
Belinda was only 16 at the time. She was in school, so she was staying with them over school vacation. One of the questions that I asked Belinda was, what time did Arthur get home the night, December 26th?
Looking back at Arthur's statements to the original detectives, he said it was 9:30 when he got home. Belinda says none of that is true.
She remembered specifically that Arthur came in sometime after midnight that night. He appeared to have been drinking, and he went right to his bed. And there was no other talk with him.
We know the murder took place around 10:48 p.m. I was a key at that point.
That changed everything. It was possible that it was, in fact, Arthur Collins that murdered George Jobin.
So Freitas goes back and re-interviews the wife of Arthur Collins and says, how certain are you as to what time he came home? She said, I thought it might be 9:30, but it could have been midnight. So they have shot his alibi full of holes. Did they do it with a .44 Magnum? Well, we're about to see.
Arthur Collins was the type of guy that would live paycheck to paycheck some weeks and no paycheck to no paycheck other weeks, and would often pawn property at George's shop in Manchester because he needed money.
It was like Groundhog Day with Arthur Collins, because he would show up, pawn off his tools, get some money, end of the month, come back, retrieve his tools, and then the same thing over and over again. But George was so nice to him that he would give, Arthur extra time to come and retrieve his tools, and he wouldn't even attempt to sell them.
In February of 2012, Bill Barry and I picked up Arthur at his home in Manchester.
The true advantage of a cold case investigator, the element of surprise. 10 years later, when a new policeman knocks on the door, Arthur Collins is hopelessly unprepared. So he's at his weakest point, the perfect time to talk to him.
And we kind of confronted him with the information that we had.
Arthur now says, well, I really don't remember what time I got home. We got pretty drunk.
We knew that he was not being truthful with us. We weren't going to let him off the hook.
So Freitas continues to apply the pressure. How much can I make you believe that you're going to be tortured for the rest of your days on this planet unless you start telling me the truth? Pressure works.
It was at that time that Arthur told us that he was present during the time of George's homicide, but it wasn't him that did it.
He knows who killed George. He's been shielding him for 10 long years. Now we're getting somewhere. At this point in this investigation, Freitas now knows that Arthur Collins, by his own admission, was present when George Jodoin was shot to death.
He just came right out and says, yeah, I was there, but I didn't do it.
Arthur said it was, in fact, James LaRoche that was the one that murdered George Jodoin.
They never heard of this name. James LaRoche is cousins with Arthur's wife.
Arthur told us that he had gone back to George's property with Jimmy LaRoche, and the three of them at the property drank. It got to the point where Arthur didn't want to stay anymore. Arthur went out to his vehicle. He started his vehicle up, warmed his vehicle because it was December at the time, so it was cold.
All of a sudden, Arthur heard 3 distinct loud gunshots, and he saw muzzle flashes in the upstairs bedroom window.
And then Jim LaRoche came running out.
Got into his truck and said, I hurt George bad. We need to get out of here. So Arthur then drove James LaRoche back to Manchester, where he dropped them off at his residence on the west side. Arthur did admit at that point that he lied about his timeline account because he was afraid of what James LaRoche may do to him.
The cat is out of the bag, Arthur, and we're under no obligation to ignore it. James LaRoche now becomes suspect number 1. So Freitas rounds up James LaRoche and brings him in.
I had kind of asked Jimmy LaRoche, what does he remember about George's homicide? And he says immediately, I know nothing, very abruptly, very fast.
He said, not only didn't I not do this, I wasn't even there because I was in Florida at the time.
So at that point, he said that he was done talking with us and didn't want to be bothered anymore. So we did some research, and from some Manchester police reports that we were able to dig up, we knew that James LaRoche was not in Florida at the time of George's homicide, that he was in fact in Manchester.
So he's trying to provide an alibi, and instead he provides a lie. It's never good to lie to the police, because they're going to make you eat it. So Freitas thinks, all right, Arthur, you say this is what happened, so we're going to set you up with a recorded telephone, and you're going to talk to James LaRoche and bring up this murder and see what happens.
Arthur was very cooperative and appreciative of the fact that we were trying to eliminate him as a suspect.
The boss has been trying to talk to me every day, and I'm getting sick of it.
Hey, don't do that. My phone goes off all day long, too, so...
Did you tell anybody about that, or?
Tell anybody about what? What night? What night are you talking about?
The night we were out there.
I wasn't out there with you.
Jim LaRoche had, was kind of dodging the questions. You could tell he was thrown off guard.
So why did you have to shoot him then?
Who?
You.
I didn't shoot him. Crazy.
James LaRoche denied any involvement in the homicide, told Arthur, hey, I don't know what you're talking about. This is crazy.
I don't know nothing, Arthur. Because I didn't do anything, so I don't know nothing.
James LaRoche doesn't say anything about the murder. He doesn't say anything about anything.
At that point, Bill and I met with James LaRoche and convinced him to take a polygraph examination concerning his involvement in the Jodoin homicide. And that test was administered by Sergeant Scott Gilbert. Scott was a member of the cold case unit with me.
James LaRoche was convincing that he was sitting for this because he didn't do it. And I assured him that if he didn't have any involvement in this, that he was going to pass this polygraph exam and detectives can move on. He answered all my questions without hesitation. We discussed whether he was responsible for this, and he showed no deception.
Scotty came out and said he passed with flying colors. He didn't do it.
Investigators asked LaRoche why did he lie about being in Florida at the time of George's murder.
And he said, well, I was drinking heavily and I black out a lot.
He made a comment to us that most of 2001 was a blank to him.
That's a reasonable statement. So all this time, Arthur Collins has been trying to deflect suspicion away from himself and onto his wife's cousin, James LaRoche.
He was blaming someone else that actually wasn't even there.
He thinks this plan is going to work, which wouldn't make any sense to a 6-year-old, but Arthur isn't the sharpest knife in the drawer. Thank you so much for being an idiot. We're now in a position to shove this down your throat.
So I wanted to speak with Arthur and get him to take a polygraph. And he agreed to take it. On the day that we were supposed to do it, and we went to pick him up, he was not home. Arthur ghosted us. For about 3 weeks, he won't answer phone calls. We go to his home. He won't answer the door. He was making himself scarce.
Arthur is in the wind. He doesn't want to talk about this polygraph because he knows what that could mean. And so does Frida's. So he devises a better plan.
We sat here, we made a call to him, telling him that we were going to come by his house around 11 to speak with him.
He sets up a tactical team around Arthur's house, so there is no escape by car from his home. The trap is set. Let's see if it springs.
Waited, and we saw him emerge from his building to get into his vehicle. He was beating feet to get out of the area before we got there. And as he passed here, the TAC team got behind him down here and made a stop. The officers that approached him in the car had full tactical gear. I think it had a psychological effect on him. I think in his mind, he's thinking that, am I getting arrested for a homicide?
It's easy to mess with someone's head when it's filled with fear. Arthur is a ball of yarn. Frida's is the cat.
Short time later, Bobby and I pulled up behind him. We said, what's going on out there?
And I explained to him, if you take the polygraph examination and you pass it, we won't bother you again. So he agreed to do that.
Well, I appreciate you coming in here today so we could get this resolved.
Yeah.
So now here is Arthur in the hot seat. We hook him up to a box and start asking him questions about the murder of George Jodwin.
He was very quiet. He didn't really speak unless spoken to, but he was adamant that he wasn't involved in it.
Just be truthful. Yeah. All right. Ready?
Yeah.
Did you shoot that man?
No.
I could immediately see that this is not going to be good for him.
Relax.
Arthur Collins failed the polygraph examination.
The only question he doesn't fail is your name Arthur Collins?
I set him back down, and I told him.
What? Jim LaRoche did not shoot George Jodwin.
No?
No.
Like that.
Well, I'm hoping you're gonna tell me, because now I know for a fact that you've lied to me.
I did?
And yeah, you lied to me.
He's telling Arthur Collins chapter and verse the lies he's telling, causing Arthur to wind up like a $2 watch.
Please don't keep it to yourself. It's the last thing you want to do.
I know.
He didn't get up and run out or or say I want a lawyer. I knew that there was more for him to say. And then I bring the detectives in, and they have further conversation with him.
Arthur then admitted that he's the one that pulled the trigger, that he's the one that killed George. He didn't seem emotional. It was just matter of fact.
Arthur said that he arrived at George's home that evening after fixing the tire, that the two had engaged in some drinking. Arthur claimed that George had attempted to sexually assault him at the table, and then George grabbed him and took him into the bedroom.
Okay, all right, so what happens next?
He just trying to do stuff to me, grabbing me and stuff.
Arthur says that George unbuckles his pants and, quote, tried to put his thing in my mouth. Well, okay.
How do you get away from George?
I just took off and went right out there and couldn't believe somebody was trying to do that to me.
According to him, he was extremely angry, enraged. He took the gun, went back into the bedroom.
Did George say anything to you?
No. I just pointed at him and the thing went off. Went off like a hair trigger. It was really fast, and then I ran out of here.
So it has a hair trigger and it just went off. And then it went off again. And then it went off again. So the gun decided to fire 3 times because you contacted it mentally? Nothing even makes any sense. He's become a babbling idiot. So there is Arthur's story. The detectives are grateful to have it because a confession is a confession.
I don't believe his account that George Jodwin sexually assaulted him is true. I don't believe that at all.
It is clear at the moment this occurs, Jodwin is so drunk he falls face down in the bed and goes to sleep. You want us to believe that he was going to sexually assault you and tried to? I don't think so. Further conversations with Glenn Baruti, his business partner, reveal a different set of facts.
Earlier in the day, on December 26th of 2001, George had called Glenn to get some advice on Arthur's request to pawn his tow truck for money.
He was specifically looking for approximately $3,000.
The issue with the pawn of the truck was that Arthur wanted to keep the truck and wanted the money. And Glenn didn't think that was a good idea.
Although it can't be proven, the likely scenario is that George Jodwin probably told him, "You're a nice kid, Arthur, but we can't justify the loan, and I'm going to have to say no."
It's possible that Arthur may have left the residence. George had gotten into bed to go to sleep for the night.
Arthur sits in his truck and he stews. He's on the point of boiling. And Arthur becomes furious because he really needs that money. Arthur walks right back in, picks up the gun, and goes upstairs. George is laying face down in the bed. And boom, boom, boom.
My thought is, after he did that, Arthur was going through the dresser drawers looking for money.
I believe that it was pure and simple. It was money. He was a desperate guy who needed cash.
Despite Arthur's confession, the .44 Magnum is never recovered.
He disposed of that weapon and holster in the salvage yard in Manchester. It was crushed and possibly transported overseas for recycling. After Arthur's polygraph examination, his confession, we took him into custody.
When they made the arrest of Arthur Collins, against my personality, I got angry because I said, damn, we missed it. But I think the people in Auburn will believe that now it's come to a close.
So Arthur Collins, in July of 2015, pled to second-degree murder, and he received a sentence of 30 years to life.
One of the sad parts about this is the fact that George treated him really well, and there was no reason for Arthur to do what he did to him.
Murder has no statute of limitations. And there's always somebody looking for the person that's responsible for it. And that should give some family members of unsolved homicides some solace of knowing that their loved one hasn't been forgotten.
George Jodwin forgot something about human nature. Humans don't change. Some people cannot be helped. But they're the same they've always been. Self-centered and dangerous. Period. The end. Believe otherwise, and you do so at your own risk. On the next American Detective.
We now have the identity of all 5 victims.
They have a spree killer on their hands. Once he begins, he will not stop.
Why is he doing this? Who is he targeting?
The fear was he would strike again, and he has.
The phone rang just before dawn, slicing through the silence of a small California town like a blade, and in that single, vibrating moment, an ordinary morning became the opening line of a story that would refuse to end. A story that would stretch across decades. A story that would be whispered in hallways, murmured behind closed doors, and carried like a scar by a community that never truly healed. It was 1998, and the fog still clung to the streets, curling around streetlights, settling on rooftops, blurring the edges of a place where nothing this dark was supposed to happen. But somewhere in that mist, a young woman had vanished, and the absence she left behind would soon swallow everything. Her name was Rachel Monroe, 23 years old, a college student, a part-time waitress. Known for her easy smile, her restless ambition, and a laugh that could lift the weight from a room. She lived in a modest apartment on the edge of town, close enough to the highway that the distant hum of traffic became a lullaby at night. On the evening of October 12th, she finished her shift just after 10 p.m., waved goodbye to her coworkers, and stepped into the parking lot. Security cameras would later show her unlocking her car, pausing as if she sensed something, then driving away into the darkness. That was the last confirmed sighting of Rachel Monroe. When she didn't show up for class the next morning, no one panicked. Rachel was independent, spontaneous, sometimes careless with her schedule. By noon, when her phone went straight to voicemail, concern began to ripple. By evening, it hardened into fear. Her roommate, hands shaking, dialed 911. Within minutes, patrol cars rolled through the quiet streets, lights reflecting off windows, red and blue flickering like a warning no one wanted to acknowledge. The word spread fast. Rachel Monroe was missing. At first, the police treated it as a routine disappearance. Adults vanished all the time. They ran away, took trips, disappeared into new lives. But something about this case felt wrong from the start. Rachel had left behind her purse, her keys, her wallet. Her bed was untouched. There was no note, no message, no sign of preparation. It was as if she had simply stepped out of her life and evaporated. By sunrise, the town was awake, buzzing with unease. Flyers bearing Rachel's face were taped to storefront windows, gas station pumps, telephone poles. Her smile stared back from every corner, a haunting reminder that someone was missing, and no one knew where she had gone. Volunteers gathered at the local community center, forming search parties that fanned out into fields, parks, wooded areas, and abandoned lots. They combed riverbanks, crawled through brush, and called her name into the empty air, hoping for an answer, dreading one. Then, 2 days later, a farmer made a call that changed everything. Just beyond the outskirts of town, in a dry ravine choked with weeds and trash, he had spotted something unnatural, something pale, something still. When deputies arrived, the world seemed to tilt. Lying at the bottom of the shallow embankment was a woman's body, partially concealed by overgrown grass. Her clothes were torn. Her skin was cold. And even before they saw her face, they knew. The town's nightmare had found a shape. Rachel Monroe was dead. The crime scene was sealed off within minutes, yellow tape snapping in the wind, deputies standing guard as forensic teams descended into the ravine. Cameras flashed. Notebooks filled. Every footprint, every fiber, every trace of disturbed earth was catalogued. But the scene offered little clarity, only more questions. There were signs of a struggle, defensive wounds, bruising around her wrists. The medical examiner would later confirm that she had been strangled, her death violent, intimate, and deliberate. No weapon was found. No witnesses came forward. No immediate suspects emerged. By nightfall, the town was locked in collective shock. Parents pulled their children closer. Doors were bolted. Porch lights burned through the darkness. The air felt heavier, thick with fear and suspicion. A killer was out there, and no one knew who they were or why Rachel had been chosen. Investigators launched a full-scale homicide inquiry. Rachel's phone records were pulled. Her recent movements retraced. Friends, classmates, co-workers, and ex-boyfriends were questioned. Everyone who had crossed her path in the days leading up to her death became a person of interest. Tips poured in. Some credible, some wild, some driven by fear, others by malice. Each lead was chased, each theory examined, each rumor dissected. But the deeper they dug, the more the case seemed to unravel into chaos. One witness claimed to have seen a dark sedan idling near Rachel's apartment the night she disappeared. Another insisted they heard a scream, followed by the sound of tires peeling away. A third described a man lurking near the diner where Rachel worked, watching her with unsettling intensity. But descriptions conflicted. Timelines overlapped and contradicted. The puzzle pieces refused to align. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and the case began to cool. Inside the police department, the investigation wall grew crowded with photographs, maps, timelines, and scribbled notes. Red strings crisscrossed between faces and locations, forming a web that looked impressive, complex, and utterly inconclusive. Detectives worked late into the night, fueled by coffee and determination, but progress was painfully slow. Each promising lead collapsed under scrutiny. Each suspect produced alibis that held. DNA collected from the crime scene was tested, but in 1998, forensic technology was limited. The samples were partial, degraded, frustratingly incomplete. They yielded no match in the national database. The most powerful tool they had offered only silence. For Rachel's family, the waiting was torture. Her mother kept the porch light on every night, as if some part of her still believed Rachel might come home. Her father replayed old voicemail messages, memorizing the sound of her voice, clinging to echoes of laughter that now felt impossibly distant. Her younger brother refused to sleep in his room, convinced that if he stayed awake, he could somehow protect what little remained of their world. The funeral drew hundreds, classmates, neighbors, strangers who had followed the story in the local paper. The church overflowed, grief pressing against the walls. But beneath the mourning lay something darker, something unspoken. Fear, anger, the desperate need for answers. And none came. As the months dragged on, the headlines shifted. New crimes, new tragedies, new scandals pushed Rachel's story off the front page. The investigation shrank. Detectives were reassigned. Resources were diverted. The case file thickened, then stagnated. Rachel Monroe became a statistic, a number in a ledger, another unsolved homicide in a state already heavy with them. But the town never forgot. Every anniversary of her disappearance reopened the wound. Candles were lit. Vigils held. Her face returned to the news, older now in digitally aged projections, a reminder of the life she never got to live. Rumors flourished. Some whispered that the killer had been someone she knew. Others believed a drifter, a trucker, a passing shadow had struck and vanished. Conspiracy theories bloomed, fed by frustration and grief. Trust eroded. Neighbors eyed neighbors. Strangers were met with suspicion. And still, the case remained frozen in time. A cold case. Years passed. Technology evolved. DNA databases expanded. New forensic techniques emerged, capable of pulling profiles from fragments once deemed useless. Across the country, old files were reopened, long-forgotten evidence re-examined, justice resurrected from dust. But Rachel's file sat untouched, buried beneath stacks of more recent crimes, a silent testament to failure. Until, one quiet morning, more than 2 decades later, a technician in a state crime lab loaded a tiny sample into a machine, unaware that they were about to detonate a bomb buried deep in the past. The DNA extracted from Rachel Monroe's evidence, once too weak to speak, finally found its voice. A match. Not in any criminal database. Not in any list of suspects. But in a genealogical registry built from millions of people who had submitted their DNA in search of ancestry, connection, and identity. A distant relative. A faint genetic echo. A thread. Investigators stared at the screen in stunned silence. After 20 years of nothing, they finally had something. A name. A family tree. A direction. The cold case was no longer cold. But as detectives began to trace that fragile genetic trail, they would uncover secrets buried deeper than anyone imagined. Lives intertwined by chance. Decisions that spiraled into disaster. A truth so shocking it would leave even seasoned investigators reeling. And as the past clawed its way back into the present, one question hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. Who killed Rachel Monroe? And how had they managed to live free for more than 20 years? The answers were coming, but they would not come easily. And when they did, they would shake this quiet California town to its core. The genetic match did not arrive with thunder or flashing lights. It came as a quiet line of code on a laboratory screen, a subtle alignment of letters and numbers that carried the weight of 20 years of unanswered questions. In a sterile room humming with fluorescent lights, a forensic technician leaned closer, heart quickening, as the software confirmed what no one had dared to hope for. The partial DNA profile recovered from the ravine in 1998 had finally found a relative, a distant cousin, a sliver of connection. And in that fragile thread lay the potential to unravel a mystery that had consumed an entire town. Within hours, the cold case unit was reassembled. Retired detectives were called back in. Boxes of yellowed files were dragged from storage. Evidence bags sealed decades earlier were unboxed, their contents handled with gloved reverence. Rachel Monroe's name returned to briefing rooms, her photograph once again pinned to corkboards, her story retold in hushed voices thick with anticipation and dread. The past was no longer distant. It was breathing down their necks. The genealogical hit led to a sprawling family tree, branches stretching across multiple states, generations tangled in records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, and obituaries. Analysts began the painstaking process of elimination, narrowing the field from hundreds to dozens, from dozens to a handful. Each candidate was scrutinized, their movements in 1998 reconstructed, their proximity to Rachel measured in miles, in chance encounters, in the unpredictable collisions of ordinary life. One name kept resurfacing: Daniel Carter. In 1998, Carter was 31 years old, a construction worker, recently divorced, living alone in a rented house less than 3 miles from Rachel's apartment. His work took him across town daily, past the diner where Rachel waitressed, past the campus she attended, past the very streets where she had vanished. On paper, the overlap was unsettling. But overlap was not evidence. Not yet. Detectives pulled his old records. Traffic citations. Employment history. A single arrest for disorderly conduct following a bar fight. Nothing that screamed murderer. Nothing that would have placed him on the original suspect list. In 1998, Carter had been invisible. Just another face in a sea of thousands. And that anonymity might have saved him. They began quietly. Surveillance. Background checks. Interviews with former neighbors, co-workers, acquaintances. Memories stirred, uncertain but suggestive. A woman recalled seeing him driving late at night, often circling the block. A former co-worker described his temper, his fixation on young women, his habit of lingering too long, staring too hard. None of it was concrete, but together, the fragments formed a shadow, and in that shadow, suspicion grew. When detectives finally knocked on his door, it was a humid afternoon, the sky heavy with impending rain. Carter opened it slowly, his face a mask of confusion, then irritation, then something colder. He denied knowing Rachel, denied ever seeing her, denied being anywhere near the ravine. His voice was steady. His eyes were not. They flickered, darting just enough to betray calculation. Years of silence had taught him caution. He agreed to provide a DNA sample. The swab was taken. The wait began. In the days that followed, tension coiled through the investigation team. They had seen this before. Promising leads that collapsed. Matches that dissolved into nothing. But something about Carter felt different. The alignment of proximity, opportunity, and now genetics created a gravity that was impossible to ignore. When the lab results arrived, the room fell silent. The DNA collected from Carter matched the profile extracted from Rachel Monroe's body. Not a partial match. Not a statistical anomaly. A direct hit. The air seemed to drain from the room as detectives stared at the confirmation, the magnitude of the moment crashing over them. For 22 years, Rachel's killer had walked free. He had built the life, changed jobs, moved houses, paid taxes, voted, laughed, slept. And all the while, the truth had traveled with him, invisible, dormant, waiting for science to catch up. They moved quickly. Carter was arrested that evening, pulled over in traffic, his truck boxed in by unmarked vehicles, red and blue lights slicing through the dusk. Officers approached with weapons drawn, voices sharp, commands ringing through the air. He was handcuffed, read his rights, and placed in the back of a squad car as stunned drivers watched from their windows. News of the arrest spread like wildfire. By nightfall, the town was buzzing, phones vibrating with messages, social media erupting with disbelief and rage. In the interrogation room, under harsh fluorescent lights, Carter's composure cracked. At first, he denied everything. Claimed contamination. Claimed coincidence. Claimed conspiracy. But the evidence pressed in from all sides, relentless, inescapable. His DNA. His proximity. His movements. The car witnesses described, matching his vehicle. The absence of any alibi for the night Rachel vanished. Each fact tightened the noose. Hours passed. Silence stretched. Then finally he spoke. His confession was fragmented, halting, punctuated by long pauses and shallow breaths. He described seeing Rachel at the diner weeks before her death. Watching her. Following her. Learning her routine. On the night she disappeared, he claimed, he had offered her a ride after her car allegedly stalled. She hesitated, then accepted. Somewhere along the drive, something shifted. An argument. A rejection. A flash of rage. His hands around her throat. The sudden, irreversible silence. He drove aimlessly afterward, panic blurring the road, until he spotted the ravine. Dumped her body. Covered it with grass. Drove home. Showered. Slept. And woke up to a world that did not know what he had done. The confession sent shockwaves through the community. For years, residents had speculated about outsiders, drifters, unknown monsters lurking at the edges of society. Few had considered that the killer lived among them, shopped in their stores, stood beside them in line at the bank. The revelation cracked the town's sense of safety, exposing how thin the barrier between normalcy and horror truly was. Rachel's family was notified the same night. Her mother collapsed when she heard the words. Her father stood in stunned silence, gripping the edge of the table as if the room were spinning. Her brother, now grown, clenched his fists, torn between relief and a fury that had nowhere to go. For 2 decades, they had lived suspended between hope and despair. Now, the truth landed with crushing finality. The wait was over. The wound, however, was far from healed. As news outlets descended, cameras crowded the courthouse steps, microphones thrust forward, questions shouted into the air. Headlines blared across screens. California 1998 cold case solved. DNA breakthrough stuns investigators. The story went national, then global, a testament to the power of modern forensics, a cautionary tale about the persistence of justice. But beneath the celebration, beneath the satisfaction of resolution, darker questions stirred. How many mistakes had allowed Carter to slip through the cracks in 1998? Why had no one noticed him? How close had he come to being caught, only to escape by chance? And how many other killers still walked free, their crimes waiting silently in boxes, their secrets encoded in microscopic traces yet to be unlocked? For the detectives who had carried Rachel's file for years, the victory was bittersweet. They had solved the case, but they could not give her back. They could not erase the decades stolen from her family. They could only deliver the truth, heavy and irreversible. As Carter was led into the courtroom for his first hearing, his eyes scanned the benches, perhaps searching for faces he recognized, perhaps seeking something he could no longer name. He showed no remorse, no tears, only a hollow resignation. The man who had lived 2 lives now stood exposed, his anonymity stripped away, his story reduced to evidence and transcripts. Outside, rain began to fall, streaking the pavement, blurring reflections of flashing lights. It washed over the streets where Rachel had walked, the parking lot where she had last been seen, the highway she had driven that night. The town seemed to breathe in unison, releasing years of tension in a single, collective exhale. But the echoes of the crime lingered. In quiet homes, people lay awake, replaying the details, imagining the unseen moments, confronting the realization that safety is an illusion, that evil does not always announce itself. It hides. It waits. It blends in. And sometimes, it takes decades for its shadow to be fully revealed. For Rachel Monroe, the truth had finally emerged from the darkness. But the path to justice, long and winding, had left scars that would never fade. Her name would forever be tied to a case that redefined an era, a reminder of both human cruelty and human perseverance. And as the doors of the courthouse closed behind her killer, the town was left with a final, unsettling certainty. Some stories do not end when the mystery is solved. They end when we learn to live with what the truth has shown us. The arrest should have been the end, the moment when the long night finally gave way to dawn, but instead it opened a deeper corridor of shadows, one that stretched backward through time and forward into consequences no one was prepared to face. Because as Daniel Carter sat in a county jail cell, stripped of his freedom and his anonymity, the investigators began to realize that solving the crime was only the beginning of understanding it. The truth, once disturbed, refused to stay neatly contained, and every new detail clawed open another layer of darkness. The confession, though damning, was incomplete. Carter had admitted to killing Rachel Monroe, but his timeline was fractured, his memory selective, his explanations riddled with gaps. Detectives sensed it immediately. The pauses, the evasions, the way he circled certain moments and rushed past others. He was telling a story, but not the whole story. And in the spaces between his words, something else lurked. They returned to the evidence. Boxes long sealed were reopened. Clothing re-examined. Fibers retested. Soil samples compared. The ravine, once scoured and abandoned, became a focal point again. New technology allowed analysts to extract information that had been impossible in 1998. Microscopic traces of plant matter on Rachel's clothing were matched to a narrow band of vegetation found miles from where her body had been discovered, suggesting that she had been held elsewhere before being dumped. A place unknown, a location Carter had not mentioned. When confronted, he stiffened. His jaw clenched. His eyes hardened. He insisted he had told them everything. But the evidence whispered a different story, one of prolonged captivity, of movement, of time. Time that transformed a sudden act of violence into something far more deliberate. Investigators pushed harder. They rebuilt Carter's life in 1998, reconstructing every hour of every day in the weeks leading up to Rachel's death. They traced his routes, examined his phone records, studied his work schedules. Slowly, a hidden pattern emerged. Carter had taken several unexplained days off. He had driven long distances at odd hours. He had made late-night purchases, rope, duct tape, cleaning supplies. At the time, These transactions had meant nothing. Now they screamed intent. The theory began to take shape. Rachel had not been killed the night she disappeared. She had been taken. The realization rippled through the task force like an electric current. If true, it meant Rachel had endured hours, perhaps days, in captivity. It meant fear, isolation, a desperate struggle to survive. And it meant her killer had lived alongside his victim, hiding her existence while the town searched, while her family pleaded on television, while volunteers scoured the countryside calling her name. The thought was unbearable. They searched Carter's former residences, properties he had rented, garages he had used, sheds long abandoned. Most were empty, stripped of their secrets by time and renovation. But one location, a small storage unit on the outskirts of town, yielded something chilling. Beneath layers of dust, investigators found fibers that matched Rachel's clothing, along with faint traces of blood too degraded for full analysis, but sufficient to confirm human origin. The unit, long unpaid, had been auctioned years earlier. Its contents scattered. Whatever horrors it once contained had vanished. Yet the implication was clear. Rachel Monroe had been held there. The news never reached the public in full detail. Authorities shielded her family from the most graphic revelations, offering only fragments, softened by careful language. But even those fragments were devastating. Her mother wept until her voice gave out. Her father retreated into silence. Her brother punched a hole through the wall of his apartment, his knuckles splitting, pain the only thing that could break through the storm inside him. For the town, the narrative shifted again. What had first seemed like a spontaneous act of violence now bore the unmistakable marks of premeditation. Carter was no longer just a killer. He was a predator. And the questions multiplied. Had Rachel been his only victim? The possibility haunted every investigator involved. Carter had lived in the area for years. His work had taken him across multiple counties. His patterns suggested surveillance, planning, opportunity. If he had killed once, could he have killed before? Could there be other cold cases, other missing women, their fates hidden beneath layers of coincidence and neglect? They began cross-referencing unsolved disappearances and murders from the 1990s. Names resurfaced. Faces long forgotten reappeared on screens. Each file reopened with cautious dread. Most yielded nothing. Different circumstances. Different evidence. But a few lingered, unresolved, disturbingly similar. Young women. Late-night disappearances. Isolated roads. Shallow graves. The connections were tenuous, circumstantial, but impossible to ignore. Carter, confronted with the implications, retreated into silence. His attorneys advised him to say nothing more. The man who had finally spoken after 2 decades now closed himself off, his gaze fixed on the floor, his words reduced to clipped denials. Without his cooperation, the full truth might never be known. And so the unanswered questions hovered, heavy and unyielding. The trial loomed. In the months leading up to it, the town lived in a state of suspended tension. Every development was dissected. Every leaked detail ignited debates. Some residents demanded the harshest possible punishment. Others grappled with disbelief, struggling to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the monster described in court documents. Carter's former neighbors remembered him as quiet, withdrawn, unremarkable. The banality of his evil unsettled them more than anything else. When the trial finally began, the courtroom overflowed. Reporters lined the walls. Sketch artists hunched over pads. Rachel's family sat in the front row, their faces pale, eyes fixed on the man who had stolen her life. Carter entered in shackles, his expression flat, his movements rigid. He did not look at them. Prosecutors laid out the case methodically, piece by piece, weaving forensic evidence with witness testimony, technological breakthroughs with painstaking reconstruction. They described Rachel's final days, her routines, her hopes. They walked the jury through the night she vanished, the search efforts, the discovery of her body, the long years of silence. Then they introduced the DNA, the genealogical match. the trail that led inexorably to Carter. Each revelation landed like a blow. The defense attempted to sow doubt, challenging the reliability of new forensic methods, questioning the integrity of old evidence, suggesting contamination, coincidence, error. But the weight of the facts pressed heavily against these arguments. The match was overwhelming, the circumstantial evidence damning, the confession, though incomplete, inescapable. As the trial unfolded, something shifted within the community. The story was no longer just about a solved cold case. It became a meditation on time, memory, and the fragile boundary between safety and danger. Parents spoke to their children with new urgency. Women walked with heightened awareness. Doors were locked a little earlier. The past had invaded the present, reminding everyone that violence leaves echoes long after the act itself has ended. On the stand, forensic experts explained how a fragment of genetic material, invisible to the naked eye, could preserve a truth for decades, waiting patiently for technology to catch up. Their testimony carried a strange poetry, a sense that science itself had become a kind of witness, speaking on behalf of the dead when all others had fallen silent. Rachel's mother did not testify. She could not. The thought of recounting her daughter's final days, of reliving the nightmare under oath, was too much. Instead, her father read a statement, his voice trembling, his hands shaking as he described the empty chair at the dinner table, the birthdays uncelebrated it, the milestones forever missed. His words cut deeper than any forensic chart, laying bare the human cost of a single, brutal act. When the verdict came, it was swift. Guilty. The word reverberated through the courtroom, through the town, through the lives of everyone who had waited so long to hear it. Carter showed no reaction. He stood motionless, his eyes unfocused, as if the judgment belonged to someone else. The sentence would come later. Life without the possibility of parole. A final, irrevocable accounting. Outside, cameras flashed, questions flew, voices rose. But beneath the noise, a quieter reckoning took place. Justice had been delivered, but it arrived too late to save a life, too late to spare a family decades of grief. The victory was real, but it was also hollow, its edges softened by the knowledge that nothing could restore what had been lost. And still, the mystery was not fully extinguished. Investigators continued to probe Carter's past, chasing the faintest hints of other crimes. Most leads dissolved. Some refused to die. The shadow of possibility lingered, a reminder that closure is rarely absolute. Even when a case is solved, its echoes continue, reverberating through memory, shaping how a community understands itself. In quiet moments, people still spoke Rachel's name. They remembered her laughter, her plans, the life she might have lived. They imagined her older, wiser, perhaps a teacher, a writer, a mother. They filled the void with stories, with what-ifs, with fragile dreams. And in doing so, they kept her alive in a way no verdict ever could. Because a cold case, once reopened, does not simply close again. It becomes a scar, a reminder, a warning. And in the space between justice and loss, it leaves behind a silence that no resolution can fully erase. The sentencing hearing unfolded beneath a sky the color of lead, clouds pressing low over the courthouse as if the atmosphere itself were bearing witness. Inside, the room was suffocating, packed with reporters, family members, and townspeople who had carried the weight of Rachel Monroe's death for more than 2 decades. Every seat was filled, every aisle crowded. The silence before the judge entered was so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself, broken only by the faint hum of the building's ventilation system and the occasional rustle of paper. Daniel Carter sat at the defense table, hands cuffed, shoulders slightly hunched, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the far wall. He looked smaller than he had during the trial, diminished, stripped of the ordinary anonymity that once allowed him to blend seamlessly into everyday life. Now, every eye followed his slightest movement. He was no longer a neighbor, a co-worker, a man in passing. He was a symbol, a reminder, a warning. The judge began by recounting the facts of the case, a measured recitation of violence, loss, and time. Rachel's disappearance. The search. The ravine. The years of unanswered questions. The technological breakthrough that resurrected the investigation. Each word fell into the room like a stone dropped into deep water, sending ripples across faces that had lived with the story for so long it felt carved into their bones. When the moment came for victim impact statements, Rachel's family stood together. Her mother, pale and trembling, clutched a folded sheet of paper, but did not read from it. Her voice emerged thin, fragile, as if each syllable cost her something. She spoke of birthdays that passed in silence, of holidays haunted by absence, of a room preserved like a shrine, untouched for years. She described the agony of uncertainty, the endless cycle of hope and despair, the way grief reshaped every corner of their lives. Her father followed, his words steadier, heavier. He spoke of the anger that had sustained him, the obsession with finding answers, the countless nights spent replaying Rachel's final moments in his mind, searching for signs he had missed, warnings he had ignored. He spoke of guilt, irrational yet inescapable, the belief that he should have been able to protect her, even when logic insisted otherwise. Her brother said nothing. He stood, jaw clenched, fists trembling at his sides, his silence louder than any speech. When it was Carter's turn, his attorney offered a brief statement on his behalf. Regret. Accountability. A plea for mercy. Carter himself remained mute. He did not look at Rachel's family. He did not look at the judge. His eyes stayed locked on the table, as if the wood grain held secrets more bearable than the faces before him. The sentence was delivered without drama. Life in prison. No possibility of parole. The words settled into the courtroom, heavy, final. For a moment no one moved. Then a quiet sob broke through, followed by another and another, until the sound of grief and relief intertwined, impossible to separate. Justice had been done. And yet nothing felt complete. Outside, the rain had begun. It streaked down the courthouse steps, pooling in shallow depressions, blurring the reflections of flashing cameras and hurried feet. Reporters rushed to file their stories, framing the case as a triumph of science, a testament to perseverance, a cautionary tale about the patience of truth. But for those who lived it, the narrative was far more complicated. It was a story of waiting, of loss, of a town suspended between fear and faith for more than 20 years. In the weeks that followed, life attempted to return to normal. Attempts, however, were fragile. The diner where Rachel once worked installed new security cameras, brighter lighting, panic buttons beneath the counters. The college expanded its shuttle services, offered self-defense classes, increased campus patrols. Neighborhood watch groups sprang up overnight, their members armed with flashlights, radios, and a renewed sense of vigilance. Parents lingered longer at school drop-offs. Friends walked each other home after dark. Small gestures, born of a collective need to reclaim a sense of control. Yet beneath these changes, a deeper shift had taken place. The town had learned that evil does not always arrive as an outsider. It does not always wear a monstrous face. Sometimes it looks ordinary, familiar, harmless. It lives down the street, buys groceries at the same store, smiles politely in passing. And that realization, once absorbed, could never be undone. For the investigators, the work was not finished. Even with Carter behind bars, they continued to chase the specter of other victims. They reopened files, re-interviewed witnesses, compared timelines. The faint similarities between Rachel's case and several other unsolved disappearances refused to fade. But evidence was scarce, memories unreliable, trails cold. In some instances, potential connections collapsed under scrutiny. In others, they lingered, unresolved, haunting the edges of certainty. Carter maintained his silence. Requests for interviews were denied. Letters from journalists went unanswered. Appeals from detectives for further cooperation were met with indifference. The man who had once hidden his crimes behind a mask of normalcy now hid behind the walls of his cell, his secrets locked away, inaccessible. Whether out of shame, fear, or a final assertion of control, he chose to keep what he knew to himself. And so, the question remained, suspended in a state of uneasy ambiguity. Was Rachel truly his only victim? For her family, the possibility was unbearable. They clung to the hope that her suffering had been unique, that no other parents, no other siblings, had endured the same hollow years of waiting. Yet the patterns unearthed by investigators whispered otherwise, a murmur that refused to be silenced. Time moved forward, relentless. Seasons changed. Years passed. The headlines faded. New tragedies claimed public attention. But Rachel's story did not dissolve into history. It became a reference point, a cautionary tale taught in criminology courses, cited in forensic conferences, studied by students learning the power and peril of genetic genealogy. Her name echoed in lecture halls, on documentary soundtracks, in training manuals for detectives who would carry her legacy into future cases. In quiet corners of the internet, amateur sleuths dissected every detail, building timelines, proposing theories, hunting for connections. Some chased shadows. Others uncovered small truths that added texture to the narrative, but little clarity. The digital age had transformed grief into data, curiosity into obsession, justice into a collaborative pursuit. And while most efforts were well-intentioned, they often reopened wounds, forcing Rachel's family to relive their loss again and again. Yet, from the ache, something else emerged. A foundation was established in Rachel's name, dedicated to funding cold case investigations, providing resources to families trapped in the limbo of uncertainty. Grants were awarded. DNA testing subsidized. Databases expanded. Each solved case became a small victory against time, a promise that no story was ever truly beyond reach. In this way, Rachel's death became a catalyst. Her absence fueled a movement, transforming private tragedy into public purpose. And though it could never compensate for what had been taken, it forged meaning from the void, allowing her legacy to reach beyond the boundaries of her short life. Still, the nights remained difficult. Her mother often woke before dawn, heart racing, the echo of that early morning phone call replaying in her mind. Her father found himself standing in Rachel's doorway, staring at the shadows on the wall, imagining footsteps that would never return. Her brother, now older than she had ever been, struggled with milestones that felt stolen. Graduations, marriages, children. Each accomplishment carried that familiar ache, the knowledge that Rachel should have been there. And sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night, the town itself seemed to remember. Streetlights hummed softly. Wind whispered through trees. Cars passed in the distance, their headlights briefly illuminating familiar corners. In those fleeting moments, it was as if the past brushed against the present, reminding everyone that beneath the calm surface of everyday life, stories lay buried, waiting for the smallest disturbance to rise again. The case of Rachel Monroe was officially closed. The files stamped, the evidence archived, the legal process complete. But closure, as her family learned, is a fragile illusion. Answers can arrive. Truth can be revealed. Justice can be served. Yet grief does not obey verdicts. It lingers, reshapes, settles into the spaces left behind, becoming part of the architecture of memory. And so, even as the town moved forward, it carried Rachel with it, her presence felt in absence, her story woven into the fabric of its identity. A reminder of vulnerability, of resilience, of the long, patient reach of truth. Because some crimes do more than end lives. They alter the trajectory of entire communities. And even when the final chapter is written, the echoes remain, reverberating through time, asking the same unanswerable question. What might have been, if one ordinary night in 1998 had ended differently? Years after the verdict, the case of Rachel Monroe refused to settle into history. It lingered in the background of daily life, an undercurrent that surfaced in unexpected ways, in passing conversations, in sudden silences, in the way people paused before answering questions about safety, about trust, about the thin line between what is known and what is merely assumed. The town had moved on, at least on the surface, but beneath that motion, the past continued to pulse, steady and insistent, like a second heartbeat. For the detectives who had worked the case, retirement did not bring peace. Some woke in the night, replaying interviews, wondering if there had been a detail they had missed, a moment they could have interpreted differently. Others found themselves drawn back to the evidence, flipping through scanned reports, scrutinizing photographs, tracing timelines that now felt painfully familiar. Solving the case had not quieted their minds. It had only sharpened the edges of their memories, revealing how close they might have been, how narrowly the truth had slipped through their fingers. In small ways, they tried to make amends. They spoke at conferences, urging younger investigators to never abandon a case, to trust in patience and progress. They advocated for funding, for technology, for training, for the belief that time is not an enemy, but a tool. They carried Rachel's story with them, not as a badge of honor, but as a reminder of humility, of the limits of human perception, of the profound consequences of delay. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, their efforts bore fruit. Across the state, other cold cases were reopened. Evidence long dismissed as useless was retested. Genetic genealogy became a cornerstone of investigative strategy. Names emerged from obscurity. Arrests were made. Families received phone calls they had waited decades to hear. Each solved case sent a quiet echo back to Rachel Monroe, as if her story had helped pry open a door long sealed. But for Rachel's family, progress elsewhere did little to soften the ache at home. Her mother found herself sorting through old boxes, rediscovering mementos she had not touched in years. Photographs of birthday parties, scribbled notes, a faded movie ticket stub. Each item was a portal, transporting her back to a time before fear and grief had redefined her world. Sometimes she would sit on the floor for hours, surrounded by these fragments, her fingers tracing familiar edges, her thoughts drifting through memories both comforting and unbearable. Her father immersed himself in routine. Gardening, repairs, long, solitary walks at dusk. The rituals anchored him, offering structure in a life that had once been split open. Yet even in these moments, Rachel's absence pressed close. Every flower he planted, every fence he mended, every sunset he watched alone carried the weight of what might have been shared. Her brother, now with a family of his own, struggled with a different burden. He saw Rachel in his children's faces, in their expressions, in their laughter. The resemblance struck without warning, a sudden, piercing reminder of a sister they would never meet. He told them stories, painting her as vibrant, kind, adventurous, refusing to let her become merely a tragic photograph in an album. In his words, she lived, dynamic and real, a presence woven into the fabric of their upbringing. Yet even as he spoke, a question haunted him. If the technology to identify Carter had existed in 1998, would Rachel still be alive? The thought spiraled endlessly, a loop of hypotheticals that led nowhere and everywhere at once. It was a cruel exercise, but an inescapable one, fueled by the knowledge that timing, more than intent, had shaped the outcome. The same science that eventually brought justice had arrived too late to save a life. In the wider community, Rachel's story became a cautionary reference, invoked whenever discussions turned to safety, surveillance, and the ethics of genetic databases. Some hailed the technology as a miracle, a revolution in justice. Others expressed unease, worried about privacy, about the reach of law enforcement into the most intimate aspects of identity. Debates flared, often heated, as people wrestled with the implications of a world where even distant relatives could unknowingly become keys to long-buried secrets. Rachel's case stood at the center of this tension, a vivid example of both promise and peril. In academic circles, her story was dissected with clinical precision. Timelines were charted, decisions analyzed, alternative strategies proposed. Students studied the case as a lesson in perseverance, in the evolution of forensic science, in the complex interplay between evidence and interpretation. Yet for those who had lived it, the academic framing felt strangely detached, a flattening of emotion into data points, of suffering into case studies. Still, the attention ensured that Rachel was not forgotten. Her name continued to circulate, carried forward by each retelling, each reference, each attempt to understand the mechanisms that had shaped her fate. In this way, she remained part of the present, her story a living thread woven through discussions of justice, technology, and memory. But there were moments when the past intruded more directly. One afternoon, nearly 3 years after Carter's sentencing, a letter arrived at the police department, its return address listing a state prison facility. The envelope was thin, unassuming, its contents unknown. When it was opened, the room fell into tense silence. The letter was from Daniel Carter. It was brief, handwritten, the script tight and uneven. He claimed to want to set the record straight. He hinted at details previously unshared, moments he had omitted, choices he had obscured. But he offered no specifics, only an implication. There was more to tell. The news spread quickly through the department, igniting a surge of conflicting emotions. Hope, suspicion, dread. After years of silence, why now? What motive could drive a man already condemned to life behind bars to reopen wounds, to dredge up memories best left buried? A decision had to be made. Some argued that engaging with Carter risked granting him a platform, an opportunity to manipulate, to control the narrative one final time. Others insisted that any chance, however slim, of uncovering additional truths could not be ignored, especially if other victims were involved. In the end, pragmatism prevailed. 2 detectives traveled to the prison, carrying with them the weight of unresolved questions. The facility loomed stark and imposing, concrete walls rising against a pale sky, razor wire glinting in the sun. Inside, the air was heavy, saturated with echoes of countless lives paused, redirected, or extinguished. Carter waited in a small interview room, separated by a thick pane of glass. He looked older, thinner, the lines on his face deeper, his hair receding. Time had stripped away whatever remnants of ordinary life he once possessed, leaving behind a man defined entirely by his crime. At first he said little. He spoke in fragments, circling his thoughts, testing the boundaries of the conversation. Then, slowly, he began to unravel threads he had long kept hidden. He described patterns of obsession that stretched back years before Rachel's death. He admitted to following multiple women, to studying their routines, to fantasizing about control. He claimed that Rachel had not been his first fixation, only the one that had escalated beyond restraint. But when pressed about other victims, he hesitated. His answers grew evasive, contradictory. He hinted at encounters that ended without violence, at moments when he pulled back, when fear or circumstance intervened. Yet beneath his words, a darker narrative flickered, one he seemed reluctant to fully expose. The detectives listened, probing carefully, aware that every statement might contain truth, deception, or a volatile mix of both. They asked about specific cases, specific names. Carter denied involvement, but his denials were uneven, lacking the certainty of innocence. In the end, they left with more questions than answers, the interview offering only a partial glimpse into a mind shaped by obsession and secrecy. Back at headquarters, analysts pored over the recording, parsing tone, cadence, hesitation. They cross-referenced his statements with unsolved cases, searching for overlaps, for corroboration. Some connections emerged, tantalizing but insufficient. Others dissolved under scrutiny. The truth, once again, hovered just beyond reach. And so, the shadow of uncertainty returned. For Rachel's family, the news of the interview reopened old wounds. They had believed the story was finished, the chapter closed. Now, the suggestion of deeper darkness threatened to pull them back into the abyss they had fought so hard to escape. They declined to participate in any further proceedings, choosing instead to protect what fragile stability they had rebuilt. In the quiet that followed, the town absorbed the ambiguity. Life continued. Children grew. Businesses changed hands. Buildings were renovated, repurposed, replaced. Yet beneath these transformations, the memory of Rachel Monroe remained, anchored in shared experience, in collective consciousness. Her story had become a lens through which the community viewed its past and navigated its future. And sometimes, on foggy mornings when the streets blurred and the air felt heavy with echoes, it was as if 1998 returned, fleeting and insistent, a reminder that time does not erase, it only reshapes. The cold case had been solved. But the cold, it seemed, would never fully thaw. Because some truths, once unearthed, do not bring peace. They bring awareness. And with awareness comes the understanding that beneath every quiet town, beneath every ordinary life, stories may lie dormant, waiting for the smallest spark to rise again. The interview with Daniel Carter left a residue that no amount of analysis could scrub away. It settled into the collective psyche of the investigators like fine dust, coating every subsequent thought, every reopened file, every late-night reflection. His words, evasive and fractured, hinted at a broader landscape of obsession and surveillance, a hidden map of predatory intent that stretched far beyond the single life he had extinguished. And in that implication, the case expanded once more, its boundaries dissolving into uncertainty. The detectives returned to the archives. Old missing person reports were pulled from storage, their edges brittle, their ink fading. Names that had once flickered briefly in local headlines resurfaced, each carrying its own unanswered questions. Young women who had vanished on their way home. College students last seen near campus. Waitresses, retail clerks, commuters. The list stretched on, a silent procession of faces frozen in time. Patterns were sought. Routes overlapped. Timelines intersected. Locations converged. But coincidence is a deceptive companion, capable of conjuring meaning where none exists, and investigators knew better than to trust it blindly. They demanded evidence. Corroboration. Something tangible. Yet time had eroded so much. Witnesses had moved, forgotten, died. Physical evidence had been lost, degraded, discarded. The past resisted excavation, guarding its secrets with ruthless efficiency. Still, they persisted. One case, in particular, refused to release its grip. In the summer of 1996, 2 years before Rachel's disappearance, a 20-year-old student named Emily Vargas had vanished after leaving a late shift at a convenience store just 30 miles from Rachel's town. Her car was found abandoned on the shoulder of a rural highway, keys still in the ignition, her purse on the passenger seat. Despite an extensive search, no trace of her was ever found. The similarities were unsettling. Late shift, short distance, sudden disappearance. No witnesses, no suspects. Carter had lived nearby at the time. His employment records placed him within miles of the store. His phone logs showed activity along that stretch of highway. None of it constituted proof. But together, the details formed a constellation that demanded attention. Detectives approached Emily's family cautiously, aware of the delicate balance between hope and devastation. Her parents, older now, their hair streaked with gray, listened in silence as the possibility of new leads was explained. They had lived for decades in the space between grief and denial, clinging to the faint belief that Emily might still be alive somewhere, building a life beyond reach. The suggestion that her fate could mirror Rachel's struck with cruel force. Yet they agreed to cooperate. Boxes of preserved belongings were retrieved from attics. Old photographs were scanned. DNA samples provided. Each step reopened wounds long scabbed over, each memory a sharp fragment of a life interrupted. But if there was even the slightest chance of answers, they would endure the pain. The forensic analysis took months. Technicians extracted genetic material from Emily's clothing, from hairbrushes, from anything that might still carry traces of her final moments. The process was painstaking, uncertain. Many samples yielded nothing. Others produced partial profiles, fragmented and ambiguous. The work progressed in fits and starts, hope rising, then collapsing, in a relentless cycle. When the results finally arrived, they were inconclusive. No match to Carter. No definitive exclusion. The evidence hovered in a liminal state, refusing to commit to certainty. Emily's case remained unresolved, suspended between possibility and silence. Another door, opened briefly, then shut. For the investigators, the frustration was acute. They had tasted resolution once. They had seen the power of modern science to resurrect the past. Now, confronted with its limits, they were reminded that not every story could be reclaimed, not every truth exhumed. Some mysteries, it seemed, were destined to remain buried. Carter, informed of the renewed scrutiny, retreated further into himself. He declined additional interviews, refused correspondence. His earlier hints evaporated into silence, leaving behind only speculation. Whether he had sought attention, control, or absolution remained unclear. But the effect was undeniable. He had reignited doubt, then withdrawn, leaving investigators and families alike to grapple with the consequences. In the absence of concrete answers, imagination filled the void. True crime forums erupted with theories, timelines, amateur reconstructions. Online communities dissected Carter's movements, tracing his history across maps, correlating his presence with unsolved cases. Some analyses were meticulous, others wildly speculative. Names were proposed, connections asserted, conclusions drawn. The digital hive mind churned relentlessly, driven by curiosity, empathy, and the intoxicating allure of solving a mystery. For families of the missing, this attention was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it kept their loved ones in public consciousness, preventing them from fading into obscurity. On the other, it subjected their grief to scrutiny, debate, and, at times, cruelty. Rumors spread. Accusations flew. Innocent people found themselves implicated by conjecture alone. Moderators struggled to contain the tide, to balance open inquiry with compassion. Often, they failed. Rachel's family watched from a distance, wary of re-entering the spotlight. They had learned the cost of public exposure, the way speculation could distort memory, the way strangers' theories could reshape a life into a narrative unrecognizable. They chose instead to focus inward, on healing, on remembrance, on the quiet work of living. Yet even in retreat, the echoes of the case reached them. Strangers wrote letters, sharing stories of their own losses, thanking them for their courage, seeking solace in shared pain. Some messages were tender, others unsettling, a reminder of the complex psychology that surrounds tragedy. Rachel's mother read each one carefully, responding when she could, offering words of comfort that often returned to her magnified, reflecting her own unresolved sorrow. Through it all, time continued its relentless march. Technology advanced. Databases expanded. New methods emerged, promising deeper insight, finer resolution. What had seemed impossible a decade earlier now approached feasibility. Investigators kept one eye on these developments, aware that today's limitations might become tomorrow's breakthroughs. The future, they knew, held possibilities that could reshape the past once again. And so, the files remained open. Not active in the traditional sense, but alive, breathing, waiting. In the quiet of the evidence room, boxes bearing the names of the missing stood in careful rows, their contents preserved against decay, their stories suspended in anticipation. Each represented a life interrupted, a narrative incomplete. And among them, Rachel Monroe's file held a unique place, both a symbol of hope and a reminder of restraint, of what could be achieved and what might forever remain beyond reach. On certain nights, when the office was empty and the hum of fluorescent lights the only sound, detectives found themselves standing before those shelves, running their fingers along the spines, feeling the weight of untold stories pressing back. In those moments, the abstract concept of justice became profoundly personal, a quiet vow to keep searching, to keep questioning, to refuse the comfort of forgetting. Because forgetting, they understood, was the true enemy. As long as a name was spoken, a file opened, a memory revisited, the possibility of truth endured. And in that endurance lay a fragile form of hope, one capable of bridging even the longest spans of time. Rachel's story had proven that. It had shown that silence could be broken, that patience could be rewarded, that even the faintest trace could illuminate decades of darkness. It had also revealed the limits of certainty, the boundaries beyond which knowledge faltered. Between these poles, the investigators continued their work, navigating a landscape shaped by both promise and loss, guided by a simple, unwavering belief. No story is ever truly over. It merely waits, dormant, until the moment arrives when it can be told again. In the years that followed, the story of Rachel Monroe began to change shape. No longer just a tale of violence and delayed justice, it evolved into a meditation on memory, technology, and the fragile threads that bind past and present. Her case became a reference point, a landmark in the shifting landscape of criminal investigation, but also a mirror in which society examined its own fears, its obsessions, and its faith in progress. For the town, the immediate shock had faded, replaced by a quieter, more persistent awareness. People no longer jumped at every unfamiliar sound in the night, but caution lingered in their routines. Porch lights remained on a little longer. Doors were checked twice. Conversations about safety surfaced casually, woven into everyday exchanges. The trauma had been absorbed, metabolized, transformed into habit. The town had learned to live alongside the memory of what had happened, carrying it like a scar that no longer bled but never disappeared. Rachel's name endured in subtle ways. A scholarship was established at the local college, awarded each year to students pursuing criminal justice and forensic science. Her photograph hung in the hallway outside the program's offices, her smile a quiet presence in the lives of young people drawn to the mysteries she had unwittingly embodied. For many of them, her story was the reason they chose their path, a call to ensure that fewer families would be left waiting in the darkness. In classrooms, her case was dissected, its timeline mapped across whiteboards, its breakthroughs analyzed in meticulous detail. Students debated investigative strategies, ethical dilemmas, the balance between privacy and public safety. They argued, refined, reconsidered. And through those discussions, Rachel's life became more than a tragedy. It became a catalyst, shaping minds and futures. Yet beyond the academic and institutional recognition, her story remained deeply personal for those who had lived it. On the anniversary of her disappearance, a small group gathered each year at the ravine where her body had been found. They brought flowers, candles, handwritten notes sealed in envelopes and tucked into the grass. The location, once a place of horror, had been reclaimed as a space of remembrance. The weeds had been cleared, the earth smoothed, a simple plaque installed bearing her name and the dates that now defined her existence. No speeches were given. The silence itself was the tribute. As dusk fell, the flicker of candlelight cast trembling shadows across the ravine, transforming it from a crime scene into a sanctuary, a place where grief and hope coexisted, fragile and unresolved. In those moments, time seemed to fold in on itself, the boundary between past and present dissolving, allowing memory to breathe. For Rachel's family, these gatherings were both solace and torment. They drew comfort from the presence of others, from the knowledge that Rachel had not been forgotten. Yet each year also reopened the wound, reminding them of the life that had been stolen, the milestones she would never reach. Still, they came, driven by a need to honor her, to anchor her memory in the physical world, to resist the erosion of time. In quieter moments, her mother often reflected on the strange duality of the case. For decades, she had prayed for answers, for resolution, for the certainty that would allow her to grieve without restraint. When that certainty finally arrived, it brought not peace, but a different kind of sorrow, one shaped by the irrevocable nature of truth. Knowing how Rachel had died, where she had been held, what she had endured, filled the blank spaces that once allowed imagination to soften the edges of reality. Ignorance, she realized, had been a form of protection. Yet she did not regret the knowledge. It had restored agency, replacing helpless waiting with clarity. It had returned Rachel's story to the realm of the known, anchoring it in fact rather than fear. And in that anchoring, she found a measure of strength. Across the broader landscape of law enforcement, the ripple effects of the case continued. Departments invested heavily in cold case units, in forensic training, in partnerships with genealogical databases. Protocols were rewritten. Evidence storage procedures revised. A new generation of detectives emerged, armed with tools and techniques unimaginable in 1998. Each solved case reaffirmed the belief that no crime was ever truly beyond reach, that time, once considered the greatest obstacle, could become an ally. But with these advances came new ethical challenges. Public debates intensified over the use of genetic data, over consent, over the rights of individuals whose DNA, submitted for personal reasons, might implicate relatives in serious crimes. Advocates argued for transparency and regulation. Critics warned of surveillance states and unintended consequences. The conversation grew complex, layered, charged with emotion and principle. Rachel's case stood at the heart of this debate, a powerful example of both the promise and the peril of scientific progress. Her story was invoked by those who championed the technology, proof that innovation could resurrect justice, that even the faintest biological trace could speak across decades. It was also cited by those who urged caution, who feared a future where personal data became a tool of constant scrutiny. In this tension, society wrestled with a fundamental question: how much privacy was worth sacrificing in the pursuit of truth? No definitive answer emerged. Instead, the debate evolved, shaped by each new case, each new breakthrough, each new controversy. And through it all, Rachel's name remained a touchstone, a reminder of the human stakes behind abstract principles. In the prison where Daniel Carter spent his days, time assumed a different rhythm. The years stretched endlessly, marked by rigid schedules, repetitive routines, and the slow erosion of individuality. Carter rarely spoke of his past. He kept to himself, avoiding attention, his presence a quiet anomaly among men serving sentences for crimes of equal gravity but different notoriety. Occasionally, he received letters from strangers. Some condemned him. Others sought to understand. A few expressed a disturbing fascination, drawn to the darkness of his story. He rarely responded. When he did, his replies were terse, impersonal, stripped of emotion. The man who had once hinted at hidden truths now retreated behind walls of silence, his inner world sealed, inaccessible. Psychologists who evaluated him noted a profound detachment, a capacity for compartmentalization that allowed him to separate his actions from their consequences. It was this trait, they suggested, that had enabled him to live for decades without confession, without apparent remorse, carrying his secret like a dormant seed. Yet even within that detachment, subtle fissures appeared. In rare moments of vulnerability, he spoke of dreams in which he wandered endless corridors, pursued by indistinct figures, their footsteps echoing behind him. He described waking in panic, heart racing, the sense of being hunted lingering long after consciousness returned. Whether these episodes reflected guilt, fear, or the mind's resistance to prolonged confinement remained uncertain. What was clear, however, was that the past had not released him. It haunted him, reshaped him, confined him as surely as the concrete walls of his cell. Beyond the prison, life continued to unfold in unpredictable ways. Children born years after Rachel's death grew up hearing fragments of her story, absorbing its lessons without fully grasping its weight. To them, 1998 was a distant abstraction, a year confined to textbooks and archives. Yet the values forged in the wake of that tragedy, vigilance, empathy, perseverance, had become part of the town's cultural inheritance, passed down quietly through example and instruction. In this way, Rachel's legacy extended beyond memory. It lived in behavior, in choices, in the collective conscience of a community shaped by loss. And still, the case refused to settle completely. From time to time, new tips surfaced. A recollection stirred by a documentary. A long-suppressed memory triggered by an anniversary. Most led nowhere. Some reopened minor lines of inquiry, only to fade again. The machinery of investigation hummed quietly in the background, always ready, always waiting. Because experience had taught them a simple truth. The past is never truly inert. It shifts. It waits. It resurfaces when least expected. Rachel Monroe's story had proven that beyond doubt. It had shown that even after decades of silence, a single spark, a fragment of DNA, a trace of memory, a moment of courage, could ignite a chain reaction, illuminating hidden corridors, reshaping destinies. And as the years accumulated, layering one upon another, that lesson endured, a quiet but powerful refrain. No matter how deeply buried, truth retains its gravity. It pulls, it beckons, and eventually it demands to be found. As time continued its slow, relentless passage, the case of Rachel Monroe settled into a strange dual existence, both dormant and alive, sealed in archives yet constantly reawakened by memory, technology, and human curiosity. It became a story people carried with them, consciously or not, shaping how they interpreted danger, justice, and the fragile architecture of everyday safety. In the town, the landscape itself had changed. New buildings rose where empty lots once lay. Old storefronts were renovated, their facades modernized, their histories quietly erased. Streets were repaved, streetlights replaced, parks redesigned. Yet beneath these transformations, the geography of memory remained stubbornly intact. Residents still referred to places in relation to the past: the corner where Rachel used to wait for the bus, the diner where she worked, the stretch of road she drove home each night. These invisible landmarks formed a parallel map, one that overlaid the physical town with an emotional blueprint. Every few years, a documentary crew arrived. They filmed interviews, captured aerial shots, reconstructed timelines with moody lighting and ominous music. Rachel's story was retold, reframed, repackaged for new audiences hungry for true crime narratives. Each retelling carried its own emphasis, its own interpretation, its own subtle distortions. Some focused on the forensic breakthrough, others on the psychological portrait of Carter, still others on the agony of the family, the collective trauma of the town. For Rachel's relatives, these productions were both a burden and a responsibility. They understood the value of public awareness, the way visibility could drive progress, funding, and reform. But they also felt the exhaustion of repeated exposure, the endless revisiting of the most painful chapter of their lives. Interviews reopened wounds. Reenactments blurred memory with dramatization. Headlines reduced complexity to spectacle. Still, they participated. Because somewhere, perhaps in another town, another family might be waiting, suspended in the same unbearable uncertainty they once endured. And if Rachel's story could hasten resolution for even one of them, the cost felt bearable. In law enforcement circles, the case remained a touchstone. Training seminars referenced it. Workshops analyzed its investigative trajectory. Cold case units across the country used it as a benchmark, a reminder that perseverance, paired with evolving technology, could dismantle even the most entrenched mysteries. Rachel's file was studied not as an anomaly, but as a model, an example of how patience and innovation could converge to rewrite outcomes. Yet beneath the professional reverence, a quieter anxiety persisted. If such a crime could go unsolved for more than 2 decades, what else lay hidden in the margins of history? How many stories remained sealed by outdated methods, limited resources, or simple human error? The questions lingered, fueling both determination and unease. And then, unexpectedly, a new development surfaced. It began with a call from a small laboratory in Northern California, where researchers were experimenting with advanced techniques for extracting DNA from severely degraded samples. Their work, largely theoretical, aimed to push the boundaries of what was scientifically possible, to recover genetic material from evidence long considered irretrievable. Among their test cases was a fragment from Rachel Monroe's original evidence set. The sample, nearly 3 decades old, had already yielded its primary purpose, leading investigators to Carter. but the researchers believed there might be more encoded within its molecular remnants. Additional markers, secondary contributors, traces that could deepen understanding of the crime scene. With cautious optimism, detectives authorized the analysis. Months passed. The work was painstaking, its outcomes uncertain. Each attempt required extraordinary precision, a balance of chemical treatment and computational modeling designed to coax information from near silence. Failure was common, success rare. When the lab finally reported its findings, they did so with hesitation. The sample, they said, suggested the presence of a second, unidentified DNA profile. Not enough to produce a full genetic match. Not enough to identify an individual, but sufficient to indicate that someone else may have been present during Rachel's final hours. The revelation landed like a shockwave. For years, the narrative had settled around a single perpetrator, a lone predator whose obsession had culminated in irreversible violence. Now, that clarity fractured, replaced by the possibility of complicity, of shared guilt, of a deeper conspiracy. Investigators convened emergency meetings. They scrutinized the data, aware of the risk of contamination, of false positives, of interpretive error. Independent laboratories were consulted. Samples retested. The results held. A second profile existed. Its origin uncertain. Its significance profound. The implications were staggering. Had Carter acted alone as he claimed? Or had someone else been involved, directly or indirectly? A friend, an accomplice, a witness who never spoke, a presence that vanished into the folds of time. The questions reopened old lines of inquiry, breathing new life into dormant files. Associates from Carter's past were revisited. Former roommates, co-workers, acquaintances, anyone who might have crossed his path in the months surrounding the crime. Interviews resumed. Alibis re-examined. Relationships reconstructed. Most yielded nothing. Lives had scattered across states, across decades, their details blurred by time. Memories faltered. Records disappeared. The trail, once faint, now verged on invisible. Yet investigators pressed on. Because even the slightest possibility of another participant demanded pursuit. The idea that someone else might have known, might have assisted, might have remained silent for decades, was intolerable. Carter, confronted with the new findings, denied any involvement from others. He dismissed the second DNA profile as contamination, an artifact of degraded evidence, an error of overreaching science. His refusal to engage deepened suspicion, but without corroboration, his denials remained difficult to challenge. Once again, the case hovered in ambiguity. Public reaction was swift and divided. Some saw the discovery as a testament to scientific advancement, proof that the past could still yield secrets. Others viewed it with skepticism, warning against the dangers of overinterpretation, of allowing technology to generate suspicion without definitive proof. Debates ignited across forums, news outlets, and academic panels, each perspective sharpening the tension between certainty and doubt. For Rachel's family, the news was devastating. They had begun to build a fragile peace, a tentative acceptance of what had happened, anchored in the belief that the truth, however painful, was complete. Now that foundation trembled. The possibility of another participant reopened questions they had struggled to silence. Had someone else seen Rachel and done nothing? Had someone helped conceal her fate? Had silence itself become a form of complicity? The emotional toll was immense. Rachel's mother retreated further into solitude, her grief once again raw, her nights restless. Her father returned to his long walks, seeking clarity in motion, in the rhythm of footsteps against pavement. Her brother, torn between anger and exhaustion, felt the familiar weight of injustice settle once more upon his chest. The story, it seemed, was not finished, and perhaps it never would be. As investigators pursued the faint echoes of the second profile, the case of Rachel Monroe expanded beyond its original boundaries, evolving into a meditation on uncertainty itself. It challenged assumptions about closure, about the finality of verdicts, about the nature of truth in a world where knowledge is always provisional. What does it mean to solve a crime if fragments of doubt remain? What does justice look like when certainty proves elusive? These questions, once abstract, now pulsed at the heart of the narrative, reshaping how the case was understood, discussed, and remembered. In the quiet moments between developments, when no new evidence emerged and no fresh leads appeared, the town returned to its routines, carrying this renewed uncertainty like a shadow. Life continued, as it always does, threaded with unresolved questions, suspended between what is known and what might yet be discovered. And somewhere, hidden within microscopic traces and fading memories, the possibility of further truth waited, patient, inscrutable, poised on the edge of revelation. Because in the world of cold cases, certainty is never absolute. It is merely a pause, a breath held, a moment of stillness before the next awakening. The years kept moving, indifferent, relentless, grinding the edges off memory the way waves grind stone, but the case refused to fade. It stayed alive in fragments, in dusty evidence boxes stacked in forgotten corners of police storage rooms, in half-legible witness statements yellowed by time, in newspaper clippings tucked into old family albums, in the minds of investigators who could not forget the faces they had failed to save. California changed around it. New highways cut through once silent valleys. Suburbs swallowed farmland. The desert towns grew louder, brighter, faster. But somewhere beneath the surface, the cold case from 1998 lay buried, waiting, suspended in a kind of forensic limbo, untouched yet unresolved, like a wound that never fully healed. Detective Marcus Hale carried that wound with him. He had moved on from homicide years ago, promoted, transferred, reassigned, but the files stayed on his desk. He reopened it every few months, sometimes every few weeks, not because he expected to find something new, but because he could not accept that this was how it ended. He read the transcripts again, tracing every timeline, every witness statement, every dead-end lead, searching for something he had missed. A hesitation in a voice. A contradiction buried in casual phrasing. A time gap that no one had ever fully explained. The smallest fracture in the narrative could open the entire case back up. And then, nearly 2 decades after the crime, a single policy shift quietly changed everything. In 2016, California began aggressively funding the digitization and reprocessing of old forensic evidence using modern DNA technology. The cold cases, long considered unsolvable, were suddenly placed back on the table. Evidence that once yielded nothing could now produce genetic profiles from microscopic traces. Skin cells invisible to the naked eye. Sweat absorbed into fabric. Touch DNA lifted from surfaces barely handled. Laboratories that once needed a full blood sample could now work with a handful of molecules. The department issued a call. Any unsolved homicide with preserved biological material would be reviewed. Hale submitted the file immediately. Boxes were pulled from storage. Evidence seals cracked open for the first time in 18 years. Gloves were replaced. Work tables cleaned. Sterile lights flicked on. The physical remnants of the crime scene were laid out again. The torn jacket, the blood-stained carpet fibers, the knife, the discarded gloves. Each item was photographed, cataloged, and transferred to the lab. And then came the waiting. Weeks passed. Then months. The lab technicians worked silently, methodically, aware of the weight each test carried. Most cold cases died here, crushed under the reality that time destroys evidence as efficiently as it destroys memory. DNA degrades. Samples contaminate. Storage conditions fluctuate. Sometimes, nothing remains. But in this case, something did. It started with the glove. A thin, black latex glove, discovered near the edge of the ravine, partially buried in dirt, overlooked for years as irrelevant debris. Back in 1998, the DNA technology was insufficient. No profile could be extracted. The glove was logged, sealed, and forgotten. Now, under modern analysis, a microscopic trace emerged, a partial genetic profile, faint but stable. Not the victims. Not belonging to any of the investigators or first responders. Unknown. The lab cross-checked it against state databases. No match. Then they ran it nationally. Nothing. But they weren't finished. The sample was uploaded into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, and cross-referenced with genealogical DNA databases, platforms originally created for ancestry tracing, family history, and personal genetics. A controversial technique. A powerful one. Weeks passed. Then, quietly, a hit appeared. Not a direct match. A partial. A distant relative. Third cousin. Somewhere in the sprawling maze of family trees, the unknown DNA connected to a living lineage. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the case exhaled. Investigators began constructing a genetic family tree, mapping branches backward and forward, tracing ancestry through marriage records, birth certificates, obituaries, census data. It was painstaking, slow. Thousands of names filtered, narrowed, eliminated. Entire family lines crossed off, until one branch refused to disappear. A man born in 1973, grew up in Southern California, worked construction in the late 1990s, lived within 15 miles of the crime scene, had minor run-ins with law enforcement, nothing violent, nothing serious. His name surfaced again and again as the family tree narrowed. Ethan Crowley. A nobody. No criminal record. No prior connection to the victim. No immediate red flags. But the math of genetics did not lie. His DNA fit the pattern. Investigators placed him under discreet surveillance. They followed him through parking lots, grocery stores, job sites, suburban streets. They watched his routines, his habits, his gestures. He was ordinary. Painfully so. Middle-aged. Slightly overweight. Fading hairline. Dull clothing. A man whose life blended seamlessly into the background of modern California. He lived alone. Divorced. No children. Worked as a subcontractor for renovation projects. No visible signs of wealth. No signs of desperation. Just quiet. And yet, 18 years ago, something connected him to a latex glove abandoned near a murder scene. To confirm, they needed a direct DNA sample. They waited. Days. Weeks. Until he discarded a half-empty coffee cup into a trash can outside a hardware store. Officers retrieved it within minutes. The lab worked through the night. The result was definitive. A match. The DNA on the glove belonged to Ethan Crowley. The cold case was no longer cold, but motive remained a void. There was no known connection between Crowley and the victim. No financial ties. No personal history. No recorded interactions. Nothing. The timeline suggested they crossed paths only once, on the night of the murder, in a collision so brief and violent that it left almost no trace beyond blood and silence. Detectives dug into his past. In 1998, Crowley had been 25, newly unemployed, recently evicted. His girlfriend had left him. His bank account hovered near zero. He had bounced between short-term construction jobs, drifting from project to project. Several coworkers recalled him as quiet, withdrawn, prone to sudden mood swings, occasionally volatile when drinking. One remembered him returning to a job site with fresh cuts across his knuckles. Another recalled him disappearing for several days without explanation. None had thought anything of it at the time. Now, every detail became radioactive. They searched his former residences, uncovering old utility records, rental agreements, addresses overlapping with locations near the crime scene. They mapped his movements backward, reconstructing a version of his life from fragments until the timeline converged precisely on the night of the murder. He had no alibi, no witnesses, no proof of innocence, but also no clear motive. When they finally brought him in for questioning, Crowley did not resist. He sat in the interrogation room under bright fluorescent lights, hands folded loosely in front of him, expression neutral, unreadable. Years had carved lines into his face, but his eyes remained sharp, watchful, as if permanently scanning for danger. Detectives placed the evidence on the table, piece by piece. The glove, the DNA, the timeline, the genealogical match. the probability statistics. The room felt smaller with every word. Crowley listened. He did not interrupt. When they finished, silence settled like dust. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, slowly, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled. I wondered when this day would come. The words landed like a detonation. The confession did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, halting, restrained, as if the story itself resisted being spoken. Crowley described a chance encounter, a ride offered, a conversation that turned wrong, a moment of fear, a moment of rage, a struggle that spiraled beyond control. He claimed it was never his intention to kill. That panic drove the blade. That terror fueled the aftermath. He spoke of blood soaking into fabric, of headlights slicing through darkness, of driving until the desert swallowed the road, of dumping the body and thinking the night would erase everything. He was wrong. For 18 years, the past waited. Now it had returned. But even as the confession poured out, something felt incomplete. There were inconsistencies, details that shifted, timelines that blurred, descriptions that lacked clarity. Detectives pressed harder. Crowley hesitated, then stopped, then shook his head.
There's more, he said.
And the room seemed to hold its breath. He described another presence, a second figure, a shadow just beyond the reach of memory. Someone else in the car, someone else at the scene, someone who vanished afterward, slipping through cracks no database could seal. The case, thought finally solved, cracked open once more. Because if Crowley was not alone, then the story of California 1998 was still unfinished. And the echo of that night, long buried, was about to resurface in ways no one had anticipated. The moment Crowley whispered that there had been someone else, the entire foundation of the case shifted, like a tectonic plate grinding beneath the surface, rearranging everything investigators thought they understood. The room felt suddenly colder, the air heavier. The confession that had seemed to close the book instead pried it open, exposing new layers of uncertainty, new corridors of darkness, new unanswered questions clawing their way back into existence. Detectives exchanged glances. They had seen this before. The late-stage confession that tried to dilute guilt, the invented accomplice meant to fracture responsibility. But something in Crowley's voice resisted easy dismissal. There was no drama in it. No pleading. Just a hollow gravity, as though he were finally surrendering to a truth he had spent nearly 2 decades burying. He said the man's name only once. Daniel Mercer. Not a friend. Not exactly a stranger. A drifter who drifted into his life months before the murder and then disappeared just as suddenly. They met on a construction site outside Riverside, both working temporary demolition jobs, both broke, both angry at a world that had passed them by. Mercer was older, lean, sharp-eyed, with a way of speaking that carried persuasion like a concealed weapon. He told stories about living off the grid, about backroad deals, about ways to make fast money if you were willing to stop caring about consequences. Crowley said Mercer talked constantly about escape, about leaving California, about finding a place where nobody knew their names, about becoming invisible. On the night of the murder, Crowley claimed Mercer had been driving. They had been drinking. They had been arguing. A hitchhiker.
A ride.
A sudden confrontation. Crowley insisted the knife was Mercer's. The glove, he said, was his, but only because Mercer forced him to wear it after the blood began to flow. The narrative twisted, spiraling into a labyrinth of blame, fear, and fractured memory. Investigators pressed him for details. Mercer's appearance, his habits, his tattoos, scars, speech patterns, accent, anything. Crowley described a thin scar along Mercer's jaw, a burn mark on his left wrist, a southern drawl flattened by years of West Coast drift. He remembered a battered red pickup, a missing tail light, a toolbox rattling in the truck bed. He remembered Mercer humming tunelessly while driving, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel, as though constantly counting something only he could hear. And then, just days after the murder, Mercer vanished. No contact. No goodbye. No trace. At first, detectives assumed fabrication. But when they ran the name, fragments surfaced. A Daniel Mercer had existed. Multiple, in fact. But one matched the approximate age, location, and employment history Crowley described. A man with transient addresses, sporadic job records, and a pattern of sudden disappearances across state lines. He had a minor criminal history: petty theft, trespassing, disorderly conduct. Nothing violent, nothing major. But the timeline placed him within miles of the crime scene during the weeks surrounding the murder. The possibility that Crowley had not acted alone reopened the case in a direction no one expected. Cold cases were supposed to resolve cleanly, neatly, with a single suspect finally identified and brought to justice. But reality rarely offered such symmetry. Instead, the investigation unraveled into something far more complex: a fragmented partnership, a collision of broken lives, a shared moment of irreversible violence. Detectives began reconstructing Mercer's movements. They tracked him through temporary job contracts, cash payments, short-term rentals, and roadside motels. They found traces of him in Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico, always staying just long enough to earn money, then vanishing again. His trail crossed border checkpoints, bus terminals, and remote desert towns. He became a ghost in the system, a man who existed only in paperwork and fading memory. Witnesses remembered him vaguely. A thin man with restless eyes. Polite but distant. Always watching. Always ready to leave. One former coworker recalled Mercer once saying, "People think you disappear when you die. That's wrong. You disappear when nobody's looking for you." The words took on a chilling resonance. As the manhunt expanded, law enforcement agencies across multiple states joined the search. Missing person databases were scoured. Unidentified remains cross-checked. Arrest records examined. Social security activity flagged. Nothing concrete emerged. Mercer had slipped beyond the reach of conventional tracking, dissolving into the anonymous tide of transient America. Meanwhile, Crowley's confession underwent forensic dissection. Investigators tested his statements against physical evidence, timelines, and environmental data. Some of his claims aligned disturbingly well. Others fractured under scrutiny. The placement of the body, the trajectory of wounds, the positioning of bloodstains, the direction of drag marks, the pattern of footprints near the ravine. They suggested two people, two sets of movements, two distinct behavioral signatures at the scene. The crime had been chaotic, violent, and rushed, but not solitary. The realization cast a new shadow over the entire investigation. For nearly 2 decades, a second killer may have walked free, unburdened by suspicion, unmarked by databases, untracked by systems designed to prevent exactly this kind of disappearance. Public reaction was immediate and volatile. News outlets seized on the story. The DNA breakthrough, the shocking arrest, the unexpected confession, the mysterious accomplice. Headlines flared across screens and newspapers. Talk shows dissected every detail. Social media exploded with speculation. True crime forums flooded with amateur sleuths hunting for Mercer's trail, constructing theories, mapping routes, searching public records. The community, once hopeful for closure, found itself plunged back into uncertainty. The victim's family felt the reopening like a second wound. For years, they had lived with unanswered questions. Now, when resolution seemed finally within reach, the truth fractured again, revealing new layers of darkness. They demanded answers. They demanded accountability. They demanded to know how a man could vanish so completely after participating in a murder. Investigators worked around the clock. They analyzed bus ticket records. They examined border crossings. They scoured desert burial sites. They re-interviewed former coworkers, neighbors, motel clerks, gas station attendants, anyone who might have crossed Mercer's path. Each lead promised revelation. Each dissolved into ambiguity. Crowley, meanwhile, sat in his cell, his confession locked into record, his fate sealed. But his mind continued to circle the past, replaying that night in fragments. Sometimes he claimed Mercer forced everything. Other times, his words slipped, acknowledging moments of choice, moments of rage, moments where he could have stopped and did not. The truth, layered and unstable, shifted with each retelling, like a reflection distorted by broken glass. Psychologists consulted on the case suggested shared culpability, mutual escalation, a volatile partnership that fed off fear and anger until violence became inevitable. Neither man, they said, acted alone. But neither could fully escape responsibility. As months passed with no trace of Mercer, the investigation began to confront an uncomfortable possibility that he might be dead. Unidentified remains scattered across deserts and borderlands were re-examined. Skeletal remains recovered years earlier, once considered unrelated, were now reprocessed with modern DNA methods. Each test carried the weight of hope and dread. Each negative result prolonged the uncertainty. Then, in a remote desert county, a forgotten evidence file resurfaced. In 2004, hikers had discovered skeletal remains partially buried beneath shifting sand dunes near a dry wash. At the time, limited forensic tools prevented identification. The bones were cataloged, labeled as John Doe, and stored indefinitely. Now, under new protocols, the remains were exhumed and tested. The results rippled through the task force. The DNA did not match Mercer, but it did reveal trauma patterns consistent with violent death. The desert, it seemed, held many secrets. The search expanded further, reaching into forgotten corners of the country. Cold case units from other states began exchanging data. Patterns emerged: unexplained disappearances, unsolved assaults, violent incidents sharing faint similarities. Could Mercer have left a trail of devastation beyond California? Or was this a single catastrophic event, isolated and singular? No answer arrived. And then a new witness stepped forward. A woman in her late 40s, living in a small Nevada town, contacted investigators after seeing a documentary segment about the case. She claimed she had known a man who matched Mercer's description in the late 1990s. He had worked briefly at a roadside diner. Quiet, intense, always scanning the horizon. One night, after drinking too much, he confessed to her that he was running from something terrible, something irreversible, something that would destroy him if it ever caught up. She remembered him saying, "Some things don't stay buried." 2 weeks later, he was gone. Her testimony reopened the trail. Detectives traveled to Nevada, tracing Mercer's last known movements through dusty towns and abandoned highways. Each location felt like standing inside a memory someone else had lived. Empty motels, closed diners, crumbling gas stations. The ghost of a man lingered everywhere, yet nowhere. Years passed. Crowley aged behind bars. The victim's family learned to live with partial closure. The case entered a strange limbo, officially solved, yet perpetually incomplete. Because one name remained unaccounted for. One shadow still haunted the narrative. One unanswered question refused to die. If Daniel Mercer had survived, he had vanished so thoroughly that even modern systems could not retrieve him. And if he had died, his grave lay hidden somewhere vast enough to erase him entirely. The California 1998 cold case, once frozen in time, now stretched across decades, states, and lives, leaving behind a trail of unresolved tension, unanswered grief, and lingering dread. And in that unresolved space, the story found its final, unsettling truth. Some crimes never truly end. They simply change shape, waiting, patient and silent, for the moment they can rise again. Time did not close the case. It only softened its edges, blurring the sharp lines of certainty into a haze of unresolved questions that refused to dissolve. Years after Crowley's confession and conviction, the file remained active, a living document that continued to expand, absorbing new fragments, new testimonies, new possibilities. Investigators rotated in and out. Technology evolved. Databases grew denser, more interconnected. And yet, the shadow of Daniel Mercer lingered, stretching across every development like an unfinished sentence, demanding an ending no one could provide. Crowley was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The The courtroom fell silent as the verdict echoed through its walls, sealing a chapter that had taken nearly 2 decades to reach its conclusion. The victims' families sat motionless, their faces etched with exhaustion rather than relief. Justice had arrived, but closure had not. There was no triumph in the air, no sense of resolution. Only a hollow stillness, heavy with everything that remained unsaid and proven unknown. In prison, Crowley retreated inward. He spoke little. The media frenzy faded. Letters from journalists went unanswered. Psychologists continued to interview him, searching for clarity, for truth, for the final missing pieces. His stories shifted subtly over time as memory decayed and guilt reshaped perception. Some days he insisted Mercer had orchestrated everything. Other days he admitted the violence had erupted from within himself, raw and uncontrollable. The truth, buried beneath years of fear and self-deception, became impossible to excavate cleanly. Meanwhile, the task force chasing Mercer dissolved into a skeletal unit, then into a single detective, and finally into a digital trail monitored by algorithms. His name was flagged across international databases. Facial recognition systems scanned border crossings. Financial institutions monitored dormant accounts. Social security systems watched for any hint of life. Nothing surfaced. He became a ghost, not just in the investigation, but in the collective consciousness. The desert remained silent. Occasionally, unidentified remains were discovered, skeletal fragments unearthed by erosion, bones exposed by drought, shallow graves revealed by shifting sands. Each discovery triggered a surge of hope and dread. Each DNA test carried the possibility of an ending. And each time, the results returned negative. Mercer remained absent, unaccounted for, unconfirmed, unresolved. Years blurred together. The highways continued to stretch. The towns continued to grow. The crime scene itself vanished beneath new construction, paved over, absorbed into suburban expansion. Where blood once soaked into dirt, children now rode bicycles. Where police tape once fluttered in the wind, homeowners planted trees. Life reclaimed the space with indifference, erasing the physical scars, but not the invisible ones. Yet the case endured. True crime communities kept it alive. Podcasts dissected the timeline. Documentaries reconstructed the night. Amateur investigators mapped routes, charted possibilities, proposed theories. Some believed Mercer fled the country. Others insisted he died in the desert, claimed by heat and solitude. A few suggested a darker truth, that he reinvented himself so completely that he became someone else, living quietly under a new name, carrying the secret like a dormant virus. The victim's family tried to move forward. They honored anniversaries. They kept photographs framed. They spoke the victim's name aloud, refusing to let memory fade. For them, the unresolved nature of Mercer's fate remained a splinter lodged deep beneath the skin, unseen, but constantly felt. Closure, they learned, was not a destination. It was an illusion. What remained was endurance. In private moments, detectives still revisited the file. They traced the timeline again. They reviewed Crowley's interrogation tapes, analyzing tone, cadence, hesitation. They re-examined Mercer's employment records, reconstructing hypothetical paths he might have taken. Each new technological advance reignited the possibility of discovery. Each year without answers deepened the mystery. The case became a cautionary tale taught in criminal justice courses, dissected in forensic seminars, cited in debates about genetic genealogy and privacy. It stood as proof that science could reach into the past and pull the truth forward, but also as evidence that some truths, once uncovered, only revealed greater uncertainty. At night, in the quiet hours when the world slowed and memory sharpened, the story returned to its beginning. A dark road, a passing encounter, a sudden eruption of violence, a body abandoned beneath the stars. Everything that followed, the decades of silence, the DNA breakthrough, the confession, the vanishing accomplice, radiated outward from that single, irreversible moment. The case was no longer just a crime. It had become a question. a meditation on identity, responsibility, and the fragility of human connection. Because in the end, the mystery was not only about who committed the act. It was about how easily lives could intersect for a heartbeat and destroy one another forever. Somewhere, perhaps, Daniel Mercer still walked beneath a different name, carrying a past no one recognized. Or perhaps his bones lay scattered beneath the endless sky, indistinguishable from the desert itself. No evidence would ever confirm which. And so, the California 1998 cold case remained suspended between resolution and oblivion, a story that refused to settle, a whisper that refused to fade. A reminder that not every shadow recedes, not every truth emerges, and not every ending arrives. Sometimes, the only thing that remains is the echo, faint, persistent, and eternally unanswered, drifting through time, waiting for someone, someday, to finally hear it.